Hello, and welcome to Sleepless Eras, where you will discover the most gently boring stories from the pages of history, designed to help you relax, drift away, and finally let your mind rest. If you enjoy calm, peaceful journeys through the slow side of the past, be sure to subscribe now, so you never miss another soothing moment. Tonight, I invite you to stay with me for a few minutes, to sink into the soft rhythm of a tale so steady, so predictably ordinary, that it might carry you into the calmest sleep you have ever known. Let go of the day's stress, settle your breathing, and allow my voice to guide you through a place where monotony reigns, where nothing happens too fast, and where every detail is as harmlessly dull as a lullaby. In this journey, we will step carefully and gently into the boring, repetitive, endlessly slow daily life of the First World War trenches. You may have heard stories of the horror and the chaos of war, but tonight, there is no horror here. There is no battle to fight, no rush, no fear. Just an unhurried, peaceful description of how thousands of soldiers live day after day, in a place so stuck in a routine that time itself seemed to stand still. Stay with me, because in these calm and colorless details, you may discover the perfect way to quiet your restless thoughts. Together, we will wander through the simple moments of tea, bread, mud, and the slow pace of a trench that rarely changes. And you might just find, as thousands of others have, that there is a surprising comfort in knowing nothing new is around the corner. So take a breath, rest your hands, and listen on. When a young private first arrived in the trenches, he would discover a world of steady, constant, colorless tasks. The walls were lined with sandbags, stacked and patrolled down with mud, forming a low and weary border against a battered landscape. Wooden duckboards lay beneath the soldiers' boots, meant to keep them above the soaking ground, but the mud found its way up anyway, creeping into every gap, clinging, swallowing shoe after shoe with the same soft grip. Every morning, before the sun could properly wake the sky, the men would stand in arms. It was a ritual, a habit, something done more for practice than out of genuine fear of attack. Weapons were checked. Heads rose above the parapet. The air smelled of damp wool and stale breath, and still nothing happened, day after day. They stood, waiting, until dismissed to drink tea that was thin, brown, lukewarm, and somehow comforting for its predictability. Breakfast never surprised them. A crust of bread, sometimes stale, perhaps a spread of margarine if lucky. Bacon, if supplies arrived, was hard and chewy, with no taste of home about it. The men chewed slowly, sighed, and wondered if the day might bring news from home. But most days were the same, with no letters, no change, only the next ritual, cleaning. Rifle cleaning was a calm, steady task. The bolt action removed, brushed, oiled, checked, returned, again and again, with hands so practiced they barely needed to look. This moment of quiet could stretch on for half an hour, maybe more, because no one rushed. There was nowhere to go, nothing to chase, only time to fill, and minds to rest. Letters were written in the spare hours, slow letters describing the drizzle, the shape of the clouds, the mud's never-ending brownness, because what else could they say? No one wanted to write of fear, so they wrote about boredom, about the same bread, the same tea, the same dull days, words chosen like pebbles in a path that led back to memories of home. And so the day passed in gentle monotony, broken only by the occasional rat running along a trench wall, the flap of a canvas cover, or the distant coughing of a soldier who had caught a cold. Even those interruptions were soft, familiar, and without alarm. The men grew to welcome them because they made no demands, caused no danger, and changed nothing. If you are still with me, take a moment to notice how calm you feel. The boring rhythms of the trenches were heavy, yes, but also strangely soothing, because they asked for no effort, no sudden thought, no quick action. The same mud, the same tea, the same stand-to, the same letters repeated endlessly until every mind slowed to match the soft, simple beat of trench life. As you listen further, imagine the quiet of dusk, when the men would stand to arms once more, their shoulders stiff, their minds already half asleep, knowing nothing would change tonight. Let your breathing mirror theirs, steady, slow, sure. You are safe here in this gentle, harmless telling of the most unremarkable days in a place that rarely woke up from its boredom. And if you find your eyes closing, that is perfectly all right. Let the gentle lull of repetition carry you into sleep, just as it carried those soldiers through night after night, in a trench so routine that even the war itself seemed to forget them for a while. Welcome back, dear listener, to Sleepless Eras, your quiet haven where the calmest and most soothing stories of history are told to help you fall into deep, peaceful sleep. Before we begin, please remember to subscribe if you haven't already, so you can continue to enjoy these gentle stories whenever you wish to rest. Tonight, I invite you to once again leave behind the troubles of your day, soften your shoulders, loosen the tension in your breath, and join me for another steady journey through the boring, almost comforting details of trench life in the First World War. There is no danger here tonight, no sudden noise, no rush of adrenaline. Here, we will remain within the slow, dull, ordinary details of those who spent their days and nights in the endless gray of the trenches, surrounded by the repetition of chores, the small struggles against filth and disease, and the gentle thread of letters that connected them to distant homes. Settle in, for the next moments will take you through the soft rhythms of days that rarely changed, and that very sameness might just lull you into a sleep more restful than you have felt in long while. Let your eyes soften, allow your hands to rest, and listen as I describe another chapter of their unremarkable, quiet lives. It begins with the morning, a pale, washed-out morning that arrives like every other, with no surprise, no loud alarm. Only the faint gray glow seeping through the canvas of the dugout. The soldiers, their uniforms damp and wrinkled, would slowly rise, rubbing the sleep from eyes that rarely felt fully rested. They reached for their boots still caked with mud from yesterday, and tugged them on with the resigned acceptance of men who knew the boots would never truly be clean. Some had socks, thin and scratchy. Others simply let their bare skin sink into the clammy insides of those heavy shoes. The routine was always the same, performed almost without thought. Outside the dugout, the latrine smelled as it always did, a sharp, sour odor mixed with stale mud. There were no proper toilets here, only a pit surrounded by rough boards and canvas sheets, barely holding back the wind. Men took turns visiting this place of relief, balancing carefully on planks so they would not slip into the mess beneath. Nothing exciting ever happened there, and in some ways, that was the blessing. No bullets, no bombs, no sudden terror. Only the familiar, boring routine of waiting one's turn, letting nature take its course, and returning to the trench with a sigh of resignation. After this came the hygiene rituals. As odd as it might sound, in this world of filth and rot, there was still an effort, however small, to remain clean. Soldiers shaved when they could, using dull blades dipped in cold water poured from battered metal cans. The soap was thin, grayish, barely lathering, but they used it nonetheless, scraping away dirt that never fully left their faces. Their hands, rough and stained, were rinsed in the same water that another might have used just moments before. There was no freshness, no fragrance, only the faint hope of feeling a bit more human for a few minutes. The same water would sometimes. They used to wipe down their feet, trying to ward off trench foot, a painful creeping rot that came from too many days in cold, wet boots. They would rub whale into their toes, massaging stiff skin, while a sergeant walked by to check that each man was doing it properly. It was tedious, awkward, and uncomfortable, but it was also a ritual, a small daily fight against a misery that threatened to steal more than toes, that threatened to steal a man's will to stand. Once the feet were tended, once the soap was put away, once the socks were pulled back on, the men gathered for breakfast. Again, no surprises. Weak tea, a slice of bread, hard biscuits, perhaps a smear of jam if the supply lines had been generous. The taste was so familiar that they no longer noticed it, each bite mechanical, each sip a simple motion, repeated day after day. They did not expect sweetness nor warmth nor comfort. They expected only the same, and the same is exactly what they received. After breakfast, there were inspections. Officers would pass through the trench, checking each rifle, scanning each uniform, nodding at boots, frowning at lice. Because lice were everywhere. Tiny gray-brown insects that crawled into seams and collars and cuffs, leaving red bites and constant itching in their wake. The soldiers learned to live with them, picking them off when they had time, crushing them between fingernails, comparing who had the worst infestation as though it were a dull contest that no one wanted to win. Delousing stations existed behind the lines, but they were rarely enough. And so lice became another daily companion, as familiar as mud, as steady as the ration line, as persistent as the drizzle. There were other unwelcome guests too, rats, large and bold, running along duckboards, nibbling at scraps of food left in corners, sometimes even gnawing at a man's boots while he slept. These rats were so fearless that soldiers named them, tossing them crumbs so they might leave the living alone. They scurried through the night, rustling, scratching, squeaking, yet no one bothered to chase them off. It was pointless. The rats belonged to the trenches as much as the men did, sharing the stale air and the slow hours with equal claim. Later in the day, letters would arrive. The mail call was perhaps the only moment when hearts lifted, if only for a breath. Envelopes passed from hand to hand, names read aloud in a calm voice. Some soldiers opened their letters immediately, devouring every word, searching for news of normality, of babies born, of cows milked, of neighbors married, of harvests finished. Others folded them carefully, saving them for later, unwilling to break the small bubble of hope too soon. Reading was a quiet event, performed in silence, eyes scanning lines of familiar handwriting, hands holding paper as if it were gold. Words inside were rarely about the war. They were about gardens, about weather, about a new hat, about an uncle who lost his spectacles again. These dull details, these glorious, pointless little facts of home, were exactly what the soldiers longed for. They wanted no drama. They wanted no horror. They wanted boredom, and boredom was what they found. After letters came more chores. A working party might be called to repair a collapsed trench wall, to refill sandbags, or to drain a flooded corner where water had pooled to knee height. Shovels moved slowly, boots sank into muck, and men grunted with each heavy lift. There was no hurry, there was no glory. Only the methodical lift, toss, tap down, repeat, over and over until the job was done. Sometimes while they worked, a dull conversation might start. Who snored loudest? Who had the worst boots? Who could remember the taste of real butter? Nothing important, nothing urgent, just talk to pass the time while their hands moved. And their minds rested. As evening approached, they prepared once again for stand-to. The same drill, the same spots along the parapet, the same rifles checked, the same cautious scan of the silent no-man's land beyond. And as usual, nothing happened. The light dimmed. The air grew colder. The distant stars shivered in puddles. Left by rain, one by one, men lowered their heads, eased their rifles down, and stepped away to eat a cold evening ration of bully beef and biscuits. Night fell softly, slowly, a blue-black curtain pulled across a stage that had seen no new act performed. And inside the dugouts, men tucked themselves beneath scratchy blankets, boots still on, ready to jump up if needed, but knowing in their hearts that tonight would be like every other night, quiet, dull, stretching on without surprise. Their minds, worn out by routine, finally gave them a gift. They let go. They slipped into half-sleep, half-waking dreams of places far from mud and lice, far from rats and trench rot. Perhaps they dreamed of a kitchen table, steaming tea warm, bread with honey, a mother's voice humming a tune remembered from boyhood. These dreams would blur, drift, float, carrying the men past the sound of water dripping from sandbags, past the faint cough of a neighbor, past the gentle rustle of a letter being folded and hidden away. If you are still with me, dear listener, you may notice your breath slowing. The dullness of these routines, the gentle repetition of days without excitement, can calm even the most restless mind. Here, in this endless cycle of breakfast, cleaning, letters, lice, repairs, stand to, and sleep, there is nothing to surprise you, nothing to startle you awake. Only a soft, steady rhythm that invites you to rest. Feel your shoulders sink. Let your eyes grow heavy. Listen to the far-off echoes of boots scuffing on duckboards, to the low voices reading letters about nothing important, to the men who once stood together in these trenches, bound not by glory, but by boredom. Know that you, too, are safe here, wrapped in a blanket of old routines, held in the comforting arms of a story where nothing dangerous will break the peace. And if you wish, you may close your eyes now, trusting that you will wake rested, calm, and perhaps even grateful for the boring details of lives lived long ago, in a place where sameness was, for many, the only comfort left. Sleep well, dear friend. Sleep well. Welcome back, dear friend, to Sleepless Eras, your peaceful retreat where the calmest corners of history come alive to help you rest. If you find these gentle stories helpful, be sure to subscribe so you can always return to these quiet moments whenever sleep feels hard to reach. Tonight, I invite you again to settle in, to release the tension from your day, to let your shoulders drop and your thoughts soften, as we continue exploring the slow, unchanging, thoroughly uneventful world of the trenches during the First World War. In this third chapter, we will go even deeper into their daily rituals, their silent worries, their endlessly repeated actions, and the dull details that wrap them like a heavy, muddy blanket. It was, in its way, a kind of strange comfort, a place where the hours were predictable, where the only excitement came from a letter arriving or a can of jam passed around among friends. This was the secret rhythm of a soldier's days, dull, routine, full of minor discomforts, but so steady that the mind could rest inside it. Imagine waking again, as so many did, before the weak morning light, to the sound of boots scuffing against duckboards, the faint drip of water off the dugout ceiling, and the occasional cough from a man wrapped in a wool blanket that was never quite dry. There was always a chill, always the smell of stale earth and sweat, and the distant, constant presence of mud. The men rose slowly, pulling their boots on with a sigh, aware that the day would bring no real change. They checked their rifles, a motion so practiced it needed no thought, wiping the bolt, testing the trigger, clearing away tiny clumps of mud that always seemed to find their way inside. Then they lined up for stand to, staring into the dim grayness of no man's land, where nothing moved except maybe a lonely bird or a drifting scrap of paper. No attack came usually, but they stood anyway, because routine was safety, and routine was the rule. Afterwards, they made their way to breakfast, a meal that rarely surprised. The same slice of bread, sometimes with a smear of margarine, and tea that tasted faintly of tin and smoke. Some might break open a tin of bully beef, eating quickly before the grease hardened in the cold air. All of it was so familiar, so perfectly ordinary, that it required no conversation. They chewed, they swallowed, they moved on. As the day stretched ahead, there were chores to be done. Sandbags needed shifting, duckboards needed repairs. Water pooled in the corners of the trench had to be bailed out with dented buckets. The smell of damp earth mixed with the stale scent of kerosene lamps burned to light the darker dugouts. Lice, ever present, continued their quiet assault, burrowing into seams and hiding in blankets. Men scratched themselves absently while they worked, comparing the size of bites, or joking in a half-hearted way about who had the worst infestation. Behind their words was resignation. No one would be free of lice until they left the trench. For good. At times, a delousing station would be set up behind the lines, with hot water and harsh chemicals. Men queued for hours to boil their clothing, to scrape their skin, to pick out nits one by one. Yet within days the lice would return, as constant as the drizzle, as loyal as a tired friend. In between these dull labors, the soldiers sometimes found time to write. Their letters were slow, measured, and careful. Paper was precious, and pencils wore down quickly, so they chose each word with purpose. They described the weather, the mud, the rations, the small bits of news from the front that might not alarm their families. No one wanted to share fear. They wanted to protect the peace of those back home, so they wrote about bread and jam, about the way the wind rattled the canvas, about how the sergeant had shouted at someone who slept through stand to. These details, tiny and unimportant, became a lifeline, a small bridge to normality. Some read their letters over and over, as if the ink might fade if they did not memorize every line. There were other routines too. Washing, though limited, was performed with a seriousness that spoke to a man's need for dignity. Water was carried in heavy cans from behind the lines, rationed carefully, sometimes shared among half a dozen soldiers. They used it to splash their faces, rinse their hands, and perhaps wash socks that had grown stiff with grime. No one felt truly clean, but even the attempt was comforting. They rubbed whale oil into their feet to keep trench foot away, massaging toes, checking for blisters, helping each other spot the first signs of rot. Officers passed down the line, nodding approval if they saw men tending to their boots, because healthy feet meant soldiers could still stand. Without feet, there could be no soldier, and so feet became almost sacred, though no one spoke of it that way. The days were marked by small sounds, the scrape of a shovel, the snap of a match lighting a cigarette, the murmur of a man telling a half-finished story from the night before. Nothing moved quickly. Even time seemed to slow in the trench, each hour dripping past like water through a leaky tin roof. The men grew used to it. The same faces, the same voices, the same tiny arguments about who would sweep out the dugout next. It was a community of boredom, bound together by repetition. And still, there was food to collect. The ration party came with tins of meat, hard biscuits, sometimes a bit of tea or sugar if supplies held up. The men lined up without hurry, stepping around puddles, nodding to each other with weary familiarity. No one pushed. There was no reason. The food was the same, day after day, week after week, and in that sameness was a strange comfort. No surprises meant no danger. No surprises meant one could rest, if only a little. As the sun shifted behind pale clouds, there might be a mail call, voices calling out names, hands reaching up to catch a folded envelope. News from home was still precious, even if it held nothing dramatic. A letter describing the neighbors, new dog, or the price of potatoes could warm a man's heart better than any fire. It reminded him of a world where nothing exploded, where no boots sank into endless mud, where life moved forward in a safe, ordinary way. Those moments helped them survive, even if just by a thread. The afternoon might be spent repairing more. Trenches, moving new planks into place and patting down the earth with shovels so the walls would not collapse. These were heavy tasks, but they were honest in their simplicity. There was no mystery, no strategy, no secret skill. Lift, place, tamp, repeat. And if rain came, they worked through it, ignoring the cold water that soaked their shoulders and ran in rivulets down their spines. They would dry, eventually. Everything dried, eventually. When dusk arrived, stand to repeated itself. Rifles checked, helmets straightened. Eyes peering into the growing darkness, as if searching for shadows. And as on so many other nights, nothing happened. The men lowered their rifles, stretched their backs, and moved toward supper, another cold meal, another sip of tea, another quiet conversation about home. Night fell slowly, almost kindly, wrapping the trench in a blanket of gray and black. The men curled up on their boards, blankets pulled around their shoulders, boots still on. They listened to the water drip, to the breathing of the men around them, to the distant echo of an artillery shell falling miles away, far enough not to matter tonight. In that steady dullness, their minds slowed. They dreamed of bread, of warm fires, of clean sheets. And they dreamed of tomorrow, knowing it would be exactly like today, and that sameness, in its humble way, was a gift. If you are still here with me, dear listener, let these steady, harmless images help you drift toward your quiet sleep. You are safe here in these calm, predictable memories. Nothing will surprise you. Nothing will chase you. Only the soft, unchanging repetition of a world long past. So let your breath slow, let your eyes close and rest, wrapped in the calmest of histories, until we meet again. As the days wore on in the long mud-choked ditches of the trenches, each moment seemed to slip gently into the next with such seamless sameness that even time itself could barely separate one dawn from another. There was no clear beginning and no sharp ending to a day, only a steady march of hours, paced by the simplest of habits and the smallest of tasks. Each morning, the soldiers woke to the familiar chill, their bodies stiff from another night spent. Half sleeping on wooden boards, the dampness of their wool blankets clinging to their skin. The air held the unshakable smell of stale sweat and wet earth, combined with the faint bite of old tobacco and the ghost of spoiled rations from the night before. Rising slowly, stretching limbs that felt heavy and reluctant, they prepared to go through motions that had become second nature. Rifles were inspected without words, hands moving on their own, wiping away the mud that crept into every corner, checking bolts, oiling metal until it showed a dull shine that would never last more than a few hours. This routine was done more for the sake of routine than any true expectation of a sudden attack. Then came the stand-to, that familiar formation along the parapet, where men lined up with silent acceptance, eyes scanning a horizon that refused to change, scanning fields so quiet they might have belonged to another world. After a while, the order would come to stand down, and they shuffled away with the slow steps of men who had nowhere better to go. Breakfast followed, the same bread, the same weak tea, a smear of jam if the gods of rationing had been generous, and the hard biscuits that left mouths dry and teeth sore. No one expected any other taste, and no one was surprised when it never changed. Conversation was minimal, consisting of a few muttered observations about the weather, a comment on the mud, a mention of letters that might arrive, but never any great discussion of plans or hopes. There was little point, because each man understood that tomorrow's meal would be precisely the same, right down to the last crumb. After breakfast came chores. The trench itself was a living creature of sorts, constantly in need of tending. Walls sagged with moisture and had to be packed firm with shovels. Sandbags slumped and split, needing to be refilled and restacked. Duckboards shifted in the muck and needed replacing to save ankles from turning or feet from drowning in the endless cold pools of water that crept higher with every rainfall. Men worked steadily, in pairs or small groups, voices low, movements unhurried, driven by no greater passion than the understanding that if they did not do these things, the trench would collapse around them. All the while, lice continued their daily war upon every fold of cloth, biting, itching, scurrying. Fingers scratched at skin without even thinking, pinching a louse here or there, flicking it aside with casual disgust. No man was spared, no matter how hard he boiled his shirts when given the chance. Alongside the lice, rats roamed openly, bold enough to steal a crust of bread or a bit of bacon right from a soldier's pack, their eyes glinting in the lamplight like tiny thieves. come to claim their due. The men almost treated them as neighbors, acknowledging their presence with shrugs, sometimes even giving them names, as if sharing this miserable home demanded a kind of fellowship. Disease walked through the trenches as quietly as any rat. Trenchfoot was the constant enemy, swelling toes and cracking skin until men feared losing their feet more than they feared bullets. Whale oil was massaged in carefully, socks hung to dry on any string or hook available, and inspections by officers kept every pair of toes accounted for like a rare treasure. When the sores grew black and the skin peeled away, a man might be sent away to the hospital, but many stayed, hoping to fight back the rot with one more rub of oil and a prayer. Dysentery too crept in, spreading from poor latrines and unwashed hands, a sickness of the stomach that drained men of energy until they lay pale and weak, unable to do anything but wait for their bowels to settle. There were few cures and fewer comforts, but the men endured, because there was little choice. Writing letters became a relief, a tiny escape from the filth. Pencils scribbled across envelopes that had been reused and folded again and again, carrying slow words of every day, routine to families far away. They wrote of nothing important, listing what they had eaten, which boots they had fixed, and how many letters they had received. Some described the lice, even the rats, in detail, because sharing that dull misery felt better than describing fear. The letters came back in return, from mothers and sweethearts and wives, carrying talk of harvests, of weather, of neighbors, of children's small troubles. These letters were read again and again until the paper wore thin, the corners softening under calloused fingers. They smelled of other places, of homes without mud, of kitchens and firesides. And even if the words were nothing special, they were precious beyond measure. Afternoons often brought more chores. Repairs on the parapet, refilling ammo stores, carrying fresh supplies up communication trenches that twisted like slow, tired snakes through the landscape. The weight of water cans pulled at men's shoulders, ration crates dug into palms, and yet the men carried on, step after step, as though their legs belonged to someone else. In these hours, there might be a moment of pause, a breath, a sip of cold tea from a battered mug, and a small talk that never really mattered. Men argued about who had the worst trench, who had seen the fattest rat, who might go home first if luck turned in their favor. Nothing serious, nothing heated, just words to pass the time. Time itself was the strangest companion. It moved slowly, then all at once. Hours crawled past while men dug drainage ditches, then seemed to vanish when a letter arrived, or a rumor passed through about a leave that might come in spring. Night fell in its familiar way, a dulling of the sky rather than a sudden darkness, a soft closing of the day that felt as inevitable as breathing. The evening stand-to lined men up once more, peering into a land so silent it might have been frozen. Nothing happened, usually, and that was good. Boredom was preferable. Boredom was safety. They stepped down, picked at their evening meal of bully beef and tea, the same flavors day after day until their tongues forgot how to hope for anything else. As they prepared to sleep, they arranged their spaces in the dugout with small comforts, a folded coat under the head, a spare sock tucked against the ribs to stay warm, a letter placed close to the chest. Boots stayed on because anything could happen in the night, though most nights passed in perfect stillness. Men slept in half-dreams, their minds weaving images of home with the drip of water from a leaking roof, the scuttle of rats, the shifting of someone's restless feet. These sounds became part of sleep, wrapping around them like another blanket. Even nightmares seemed dulled by the daily sameness, and in that dullness, rest was easier to find. There was a rhythm to it all, as sure as a heartbeat. The men woke, ate, stood to, cleaned, repaired, scratched, wrote, read, waited, stood to. Again, ate and slept. Over and over, in a cycle so complete that the mind could rest inside it, trusting that nothing new would come to disturb the fragile peace of its repetition. One day, like another, each hour blending, each action familiar. The months went by, marked only by the change of seasons, a colder wind, a thicker mud, a different kind of drizzle. Otherwise, the trench remained itself, unchanging, uncaring, a place of boredom so deep that it swallowed fear and left only a quiet, resigned calm. If your eyes are growing heavy now, know that this is how it was for them, and how it can be. For you, nothing here will surprise you. Nothing will rush you. Let your breathing match theirs, slow and steady, as you imagine the weight of your boots on the duckboards, the distant sound of water, the calm hush of a place where days stretched without urgency. There is no enemy at this moment, no shell to fear, no danger to wake you. Only the soft, low chorus of men settling into another night, ready to begin again tomorrow in the same quiet, unremarkable way. If sleep comes, let it come gently, as it did for them, wrapped in the repetitive safety of the dullest place on earth. Rest well, and hold these slow rhythms in your dream until another story returns to carry you further along this peaceful path. The days continued to stretch out with a soft, unbroken dullness, as if time itself had become another occupant of the trenches, heavy with mud, slow with repetition, unwilling to move in any direction other than forward through the same steady routines. Each morning came with that pale, colorless light, struggling to break through the low clouds that hung like a permanent curtain over the shattered landscape. The soldiers stirred from their uneasy sleep, bones aching from the cold, muscles stiff from lying half-curled on hard wooden boards, their blankets damp and clinging, holding last night's sweat and the chill of the earth. Slowly, they pulled themselves upright, boots still on as always, and prepared to begin another round of tasks that had no ending. There was no loud call, no trumpet, no sense of alarm, just a quiet understanding among them that the same sequence must begin again. Rifles were picked up and checked, with fingers moving automatically across bolts and barrels, cleaning away whatever small bits of muck or rust had crept in overnight. Then the stand-to, lining up in the early gloom, eyes half focused on a no-man's land that was almost always empty at this hour, a land as lifeless as the gray sky above. The air smelled of stale smoke, wet canvas, and the faint sourness of men who had not washed properly in days. The stand-to ended, and the men stepped away without ceremony, drifting to their morning ration line where they received the same bread, the same weak tea, and if they were lucky, a cold smear of bacon that barely softened in their mouths. Conversation was brief, mostly low comments about the weather or a letter from home. No one wasting words on anything hopeful or strange, because the day ahead would offer nothing new. After breakfast, the trench work began again. There were sandbags to fill and stack as the walls of the trench seemed to sag overnight under the weight of rain and mud. Some men baled water from the corners, their boots half submerged in brown puddles, shivering as they worked to empty them with dented old buckets. Others mended duckboards, hammering planks into place so their boots might stay dry for at least a few hours. Here and there, small conversations drifted through the work, half-hearted jokes about rats or lice, small insults passed without heat, more habit than anything else. Above them, the sky remained low and sullen, dripping with a quiet drizzle that made the mud shine with a dull, sticky gleam. From time to time, an officer would walk through, nodding at repairs, glancing over rifles, checking boots for signs of trench foot. The officers, too, had fallen into the rhythm, their voices soft and unhurried, calling the same instructions each day like a prayer that needed repeating to keep the walls from falling. The hours passed slowly, broken only by the creaking arrival of a ration party, a few crates of tinned meat, hard biscuits, tea, sometimes a slab of jam if luck had favored them. These supplies were carried through the communication trenches, passed from hand to hand, unloaded with the same quiet efficiency that came from knowing there would be no feast, only the same meager meal repeated tomorrow and the next day. The men collected their food without complaint, taking the same portions they had taken 100 times before, eating quickly, wiping their hands on trousers already stained with mud. When their stomachs were full, or at least not empty, they returned to their chores. The trench had to be maintained, or it would swallow them. Duckboards had to stay above the rising water, sandbags had to hold back the soft walls, and drainage had to keep moving, or everything would rot. It was a kind of endless labor, a slow war not against an enemy of flesh, but against the trench itself, which seemed determined to return to the earth, to melt back into mud and rain and vanish. The men fought this collapse with shovels and buckets and boards, moving with the resigned patience of men who knew there was no end. As afternoon came, some soldiers wrote letters, their pencils scratching across scraps of paper already wrinkled from damp pockets. They wrote to mothers, to wives, to sweethearts, telling them about nothing in particular, a new rip in a sock, a cold that would not go away, a sergeant who snored too loudly. These small, colorless details became their greatest treasures, reminders that somewhere beyond these trenches, normal life still moved, that somewhere cows still grazed, fires still burned, and children still laughed. When the mail arrived, they gathered around, hands reaching for folded envelopes, eyes hungry for familiar handwriting. They read each letter again and again, memorizing every dull word, every small bit of home. Some tucked the letters into breast pockets, carrying them like a second heartbeat. The routine continued into the evening. Another stand to. The same men lined up with the same weapons, peering out at a landscape that seemed as dead as it had been at dawn. Darkness came slowly, swallowing the sky with deep blue shadows, until only the faint lamps in the dugouts lit the path back to their bunks. Supper was eaten in the same quiet way, a bit of tinned meat, hard bread, tea gone cold before they finished. Then they settled for the night, arranging their places carefully, pulling blankets around their shoulders, boots left on because no one ever knew for certain if an alarm might come. Most nights nothing came, and so they slept or half-slept, minds drifting in and out of dreams, woven with the soft sounds of water dripping from a sagging roof, the scuttle of a rat searching for crumbs, the coughing of a neighbor who could not quite shake the trench fever from his bones. These sounds became a lullaby of sorts, wrapping them in a strange safety, a familiarity that calmed even when it disgusted. The dreams were small dreams, about warm kitchens, clean clothes, fresh bread, and familiar faces. No one dreamed of medals or glory. They dreamed of boring, ordinary days that felt impossibly far away. In the quiet of the night, the soldiers rested their heavy limbs, trusting that the same routine would come again in the morning, predictable, steady, safe in its monotony. There was a peace in that, a strange gift, the knowledge that nothing would change. The trench would wait for them. The trench would welcome them back to its mud and its rats and its endless small labors, and they would answer day after day with the same movements, the same sighs, the same unhurried words. If your breathing has slowed, if your eyes have grown heavy, you are joining them in their rhythm, finding the same calm and repetition that they did, the same quiet surrender to a world that refused to hurry. Let that dullness soothe you. Let the soft, patient routine hold you, until the last scraps of tension leave your body and sleep finally takes you. Here, nothing will surprise you, nothing will rush you, and nothing will disturb the gentle path you follow through this boring, comforting history. Drift away now, knowing that you are safe in a story where even time itself dares not move too quickly, where mud and bread and letters are the only things that truly matter, where the dreams are simple, the hours are long, and peace comes from the simple act of doing the same thing again tomorrow. The pattern of days continued to spin on its quiet axis, so steady and unchanging that the soldiers in the trenches could have measured time not by clocks, but by the slow dance of their own. Repeated movements. Each morning crawled out of the dim, watery sky with a light so weak it barely deserved to be called dawn. The men moved from half-sleep to half-wakefulness, stirring on rough wooden boards that creaked beneath their weight, their bodies stiff, their minds still tangled in the thin, fragile dreams of a place far away from mud and rats. They rose without hurry, because there was no hurry to be had, slipping their boots back into the same sticky, half-frozen lumps of clay where they had left them the night before. Every man had learned not to expect dry boots, or fresh air, or a day without the scraping sounds of lice working through the seams of their uniforms. Their hands automatically checked their weapons, wiping away the thin film of moisture that had crept in overnight, pulling the bolt, checking the action, making sure nothing had jammed. Then came the stand-to, that daily ritual which seemed to serve more as a reminder of discipline than a real act of defense. The soldiers lined up along the parapet, eyes scanning a field so familiar it felt like a painting they had stared at too many times. The same torn wires, the same shallow craters, the same silent birds perched on skeletal trees that refused to fall completely. For a while, they waited, breathing the cold air, listening to the gentle shift of mud beneath their boots. And then, as always, they stood down, returning to breakfast without celebration. The same bread, the same tea gone lukewarm before it, touched their lips, the same small tins of meat whose taste they had long since memorized. No one asked for anything more because no one believed anything more would come. Conversation was soft and clipped, bits of news about a letter that might arrive today, or the name of someone rotated out on leave. After the meal, the work began. Again, the trench was an endless chore, a creature always falling apart, always demanding attention. Shovels bit into mud that was as heavy as concrete, lifted and packed, moved and pressed, until the sagging walls stood straight again for at least a day or two. Duckboards slipped beneath their feet, warping under the weight of so many men, and had to be straightened or replaced. Sandbags that had burst leaked their muddy stuffing into puddles, and so new ones were filled, stitched shut, and stacked. Once more, it was thankless labor, done in the knowledge that rain or shelling would soon ruin it all again. Yet still they did it, because a collapsing trench could mean death as surely as a bullet. The air was a permanent companion, a smell made of damp wool, sweat, bad tobacco, and the faint sour staleness of food half-eaten and left behind. There were no perfumes, no soap strong enough to wash it away, and so the men simply grew used to it, the scent of the trench becoming part of their skin. Time was slow, dragging its feet through the day, sometimes pausing altogether when a rat scurried across a duckboard, bold as any house pet, or when a small argument broke out about whose turn it was to collect the rations. They spoke of small things, a new hole in a sock, a letter from a sister, the rumor that a certain corporal had been sent home because his lungs could no longer handle the rot of this place. These scraps of conversation passed like half-thought. Prayers, lifting a little of the burden, reminding the men that they still had voices and names and stories beyond the endless brown around them. In the quieter hours, they found small tasks to fill the space between waiting, picking lice from seams, mending torn patches on jackets, cleaning rifles that were already spotless, writing short notes home about absolutely nothing. They described the same stale bread, the same thin tea, the same mud, as if chronicling these dull moments might keep their minds alive. When mail arrived, it was like a gentle breeze through heavy air. Envelopes were passed hand to hand, each man cradling the paper like a small flame of hope. The words inside rarely spoke of adventure or worry. They spoke, instead of cows calving in spring, of potatoes planted, of children's laughter, of old neighbors married or sick. These boring, ordinary details were more precious than any medals, because they meant the world was still there, unbroken, steady, waiting for them if they ever made it home. The afternoon returned them to chores, scraping drainage ditches, repairing collapsed fire steps, hammering nails into ductboards with methodical, resigned movements. No one worked quickly, because quickness was wasted here, only bringing more exhaustion. Instead, they worked steadily, moving with a dull patience learned over endless weeks. Sometimes they stopped to scratch, shifting lice that crawled across their necks or to pick at small sores that refused to heal. And yet, somehow they endured, because endurance was all they had left to give. Supper came late, a repeat of breakfast in all but name, the same meat, the same bread, the same tea, a menu so constant it might have been printed in their dreams. The men ate slowly, sharing a joke now and then, their voices low, laughter coming out tired and weak but still alive. They cleaned their mugs with a scrap of cloth, wiped greasy fingers on their sleeves, and then waited for stand to again, the evening ritual that kept them rooted to the trench. Rifles were checked one more time, boots knocked against duckboards to loosen the worst of the mud, helmets adjusted. Then silence, a silence so deep it rang in their ears, pressing around them like a heavy woolen blanket. Most nights nothing happened. They stood down, shoulders relaxing, stepping back toward the dugouts where their blankets waited, scratchy and still damp from the night before. Sleep came slowly, never complete, broken by the coughing of a neighbor, by the squeal of a rat, by the slow drip of water from the roof. Dreams were pale, small things, the image of a mother's face, the smell of fresh bread, a green hill with no wire and no mud. Those dreams stayed just out of reach, but even reaching for them was enough to bring a moment of peace. The night passed without hurry, giving them a few hours of rest before the routine would begin again. There was a comfort in knowing nothing would change, that tomorrow would ask nothing new of them, would demand no fresh courage. Only the same patience, the same quiet strength, the same steady rhythm. If you feel yourself drifting now, dear listener, know that you are sharing the calm of those soldiers, finding rest in their dull patterns, their boring but safe routines. Let your mind sink into the sameness, the unremarkable details, the repeated motions that asked no questions and gave no surprises. Breathe slowly, feel your body grow heavier, and trust that this story will hold you steady until sleep comes, gentle and deep, carrying you into a place where time moves no faster than you. Wish, where each moment is predictable and harmless, where even the mud might feel familiar and kind. Rest now and let these endless calm details guide you safely into dreams, ready to return when you wish, as the soldiers did to the dull, slow peace of the trench. In the trench, the hours went on as if time had forgotten how to move forward, slipping instead into a circle of repetition so perfect and unbroken that even the men themselves felt more like parts of a machine than living souls. They woke once again to the soft, damp light of dawn, which arrived without drama, slipping over the low lip of sandbags with a weary hush. The men stirred on their boards, pulling themselves upright with the dull ache of backs that had slept too long in damp cloth, their shoulders tight and uncooperative after another night half dreaming, in a nest of lice and stale blankets. Boots still wet from yesterday's sludge waited by their bedsides, their stiff leather reluctant to bend to the shape of tired feet. There was no choice, though, and each man pushed his feet inside, wincing a little as cold mud met skin already softened and raw. Their first steps of the day were slow, a practiced rhythm that spoke of routine more than readiness. Rifles were checked as they always were, the same movements repeated every morning, a click of the bolt, a wipe of the barrel, a half-hearted glance down the sights. Once satisfied, they moved into formation for stand-to, staring with unblinking boredom into the pale gray fields where nothing stirred, not even a bird bold enough to cross the dead wires. It was a view so unchanged that it barely registered on the mind anymore, as familiar as the backs of each other's heads, as dull as the taste of cold tea. The stand-to ended after long minutes of silence, and they shuffled back to their breakfast, that thin slice of bread, the same tepid tea, the bully beef that clung to the spoon with a smell of salt and tin. They ate with mechanical movements, exchanging a few small grumbles about a missing letter or a damp blanket. But no one expected anything different, and no one was surprised when nothing improved. The trench was their world, and the trench did not change. After the meager breakfast, the men divided themselves into work details. Shovels scraped through the same thick mud, stacking sandbags again and again to shore up walls that sagged under the weight of rain and footsteps. Boards were nailed into place where the duckboards had rotted through, so that boots might stay out of water for at least another day. Buckets were filled and emptied, carrying away pools of filthy brown water that seemed to reappear as soon as a man turned his back. The rhythm of the work was slow and forgiving, and in that slowness there was a strange comfort. No one could fail, because the trench would always need fixing again tomorrow. No one could hurry, because there was nowhere to go. Overhead, a dull sky pressed down with a soft drizzle that seeped through seams and collars, finding its way into every shirt, every sleeve, every shiver. The smell of the trench was a part of them now, clinging to skin like a second sauerkraut. There was no point in fighting it, so they let it settle, the smell of earth and sweat and stale rations and faintly sweet pipe smoke drifting through the lanes. Rats were busy, even in the daylight, scurrying over duckboards in bold little raids, noses twitching, tails trailing behind like scribbles in the mud. Some soldiers laughed at their boldness, while others hissed them away, but mostly they accepted the rats as neighbors, as permanent as the lice that crawled through their seams, biting in small, sharp reminders of life in these quiet ditches. Later in the day, a man might pull a pencil stub from his pocket, smoothing out a damp scrap of paper that had survived one more night in a coat pocket. He would write to his mother, or perhaps to a girl whose face he remembered in flickers, telling her of nothing important, that the rain was steady, that the rats were fat, that his boots had started to crack along the toes. These small details were treasures, carefully chosen to sound dull, to spare the listener from worry, to remind him of a world that still cared about the shape of a loaf of bread or the planting of a garden. Other men read their letters again, and again, lips moving with the words, holding paper that smelled faintly of home, even through the damp. Those letters lived close to their hearts, folded and hidden in tunics, small shields against the monotony of mud. The afternoon passed, with more routine. Sandbags needed shifting again, for the walls never held their shape, and drainage ditches silted up faster than any shovel could clear them. Boots grew heavier with every hour, carrying another layer of wet earth until feet felt welded to the ground. The officers walked through in their soft, tired voices, offering no grand plans, only the same reminders. Check your rifle. Keep your socks dry. Rub your feet with whale oil if you have any left. A man might cough and another would glance over, but no one panicked. Coughs were as common as lice, as constant as the drip of water from the overhead tarps. Supper came, cold and thin and familiar. Another tin of bully beef, a broken biscuit, tea so weak it might as well have been rainwater. They ate in small groups, knees pulled to chests, backs pressed against the muddy trench walls, and spoke only enough to pass the time. A joke here, a grunt of annoyance there, but no great tales, no wild dreams. They had learned through endless days that hope was dangerous, and expectation was a cruel trick. Better to keep things boring. Better to let the routine do its work. Evening stand-to was the same. A slow gathering of men who peered out at a land that might as well have been frozen in place. Their hands rested on rifles they had checked a dozen times, eyes blinking against the gloom, minds as blank as the poem race. Colorless sky. After long minutes of stillness, they stepped back, their shoulders dropping, letting the long day fade into another silent night. In their dugouts, they arranged themselves carefully, each man taking a known spot, each blanket folded in the same way, each boot placed so it could be pulled on in a second if needed. The smell of sweat, of wet wool, of sour breath and tobacco mingled with the gentle noises of rats searching for crumbs and the soft scratching of lice. It was a lullaby of sorts, steady, predictable, as harmless as the tapping of rain on canvas. Sleep came slowly, as it always did, broken by small sounds, a man shifting, a cough, a sigh. The dreams were thin and gray, pictures of things half remembered, a table set for supper, a child's laugh, the creak of a gate. No one dreamed of heroism, only of ordinariness, because that was the greatest prize of all. And as their eyes closed, they trusted that tomorrow would look exactly like today, that the trench would still be there to greet them. The mud waiting, the rats waiting, the routine waiting, all ready to begin again without surprise or fear. If you too find your eyes heavy now, feel how steady these dull days were, how peaceful in their very sameness. Let your thoughts rest in the calm, where nothing must change and nothing must be solved, where the smallest details matter and the hours pass without urgency. Take a deep breath and settle into the boring safety of another trench night, knowing the dawn will come again, just as gray, just as familiar, and just as forgiving. In the long hush of the trench, where days folded one into another like drab cloth stacked on a dusty shelf, the men continued their slow dance of ritual, a pattern of movement so familiar that it might have been written into their bones. As always, the morning arrived in a wash of pale, weak light, the air heavy with the stale damp of too many breaths trapped under canvas roofs. Boots, still wet and reluctant, waited beside stiff blankets, their laces crusted with last night's mud. The soldiers stirred, rising slowly, bodies stiff with sleep that had never gone deep enough to wash away the ache of old bruises and cold. Limbs. One by one, they pulled their boots on, feet slipping into the half-frozen leather with a resigned shudder, and they stepped out to face the same battered planks, the same walls of sagging sandbags, the same soft drizzle that clung to every surface. Rifles were checked in the same order, the same motions, a ritual so deeply ingrained that hands seemed to move of their own accord, wiping, pulling, clicking, setting each piece in place before resting the weapon against the chest like an old companion. The end stand to, the silent ritual. Men lined against the parapet, with eyes staring into a no-man's land as featureless and colorless as their dreams. The silence pressed against them, broken only by a cough or the distant squeak of a rat exploring an empty ration tin. Nothing moved out there, nothing ever did, yet they watched anyway, because watching was the rule, and rules were all they had left to trust. When stand to ended, they drifted away in ones and twos toward breakfast. The same bread, the same tea, the same meat with its hint of rust and salt. Their hands moved automatically, tearing, chewing, swallowing, voices low and slow. The conversation was short, if it happened at all, and no one expected it to be otherwise. After breakfast, the morning work began. Buckets were lifted, water scooped, and thrown out of low spots that filled again with every new drizzle. Shovels bit into the clay, lifting mud that clung like glue, repairing a wall here, packing a hole there, repeating movements taught by countless days. Boots squelched with every step, the mud pulling back as if unwilling to let them go, a silent tug of the earth reminding them where they stood. The air smelled of sweat, mold, and that faint metallic edge of old boiled tea, tangled with the deeper, riper odor of unwashed clothes and sour breath. No one complained. Complaints had been lost weeks ago, abandoned like useless metals at the bottom of a muddy pool. Instead, they worked, shoulders hunched, breathing steady, minds half empty of anything beyond the next step, the next shovel of mud, the next flick of water from the lip of a dented bucket. The officers passed through in their dull coats, faces almost as tired as the men they oversaw, checking boots, glancing into dugouts, repeating the same instructions in voices that had lost their sharp edges. Socks should be changed if they are dirty. Whale oil should be rubbed into toes to keep trench foot at bay. Helmets straight, rifles clean, no sleeping on sentry duty. These rules rolled over the men like a soft wave, expected and accepted, reminders of order in a place where chaos was always a rumor away. Midday came without fanfare, a gray sun refusing to break through the thick ceiling of clouds. A ration party arrived with its familiar burden of tins and stale bread, carried over duckboards, that creaked under each heavy step. The men formed a quiet line, eyes down, waiting their turn to take the same portion they had taken yesterday, and the day before, and would take again tomorrow. A tin of bully beef, a chunk of bread, maybe a pinch of sugar if the supply held. Out. They carried their food back to the same spots, knees tucked up, backs pressed against the damp trench walls. Eating slowly, chewing carefully, pausing only to wipe away the faint drizzle collecting on their sleeves. A joke might slip between them, half laughed, half grumbled, about rats stealing food or the dullness of the same meat day after day. But the jokes were routine, just another small shield against the slow crawl of the hours. The afternoon brought more chores because the trench never slept. A drainage ditch needed clearing, its muddy water swirling around boots until they felt more like waterlogged anchors than shoes. Duckboards had to be lifted and straightened, splinters digging into palms grown too rough to feel much pain. The sandbags sagged under their wet weight, needing fresh earth, more ties, more stacking. An endless process of building and rebuilding that gave the men something to do, something to think about, something to measure the day with. Letters arrived later, passed hand to hand, each envelope carrying the faint warmth of a world far from here. The words inside were precious not because they brought news, but because they brought sameness stories of a neighbor's new calf, a child's first steps, a harvest of potatoes, a mother's soft worry. Nothing exciting, nothing fearful, just the dull, beautiful hum of a life untouched by wire and shells. Men read their letters over and over, tracing the words with dirty thumbs, folding and unfolding the pages until the paper grew thin. Some tucked them inside tunic pockets, close to the heart, a small shield of memory that might carry them through one more night. As dusk settled, the stander returned, the same slow shuffle to the parapet, the same scan of the pale land, the same stillness. Rifles rested against shoulders, fingers curled around wood worn smooth by countless hands. The air cooled, the drizzle became a fine mist, and the trench seemed to sigh along with the men. Nothing happened, and that was a kind of grace, a quiet gift in a world that could so easily become loud and sharp. When the stand-to ended, they stepped back to their dugouts, boots scraping along boards, shoulders sinking in relief. Supper waited, another cold portion of bully beef, a bit of bread, tea lukewarm in battered mugs. The taste no longer mattered. They ate because that was what the evening called for, and they followed its call without question. After, they settled themselves into their corners, pulling blankets over tired bodies, letting the soft, damp smell of wool wrap around them. Boots stayed on, laces loosened but ready, because even boredom had its rules, and the rules were that a man must always be ready. Sleep crept in slowly, carefully, as if afraid to startle anyone. The sounds of the trench hummed all around, a rat digging for crumbs, water dripping from a tarp, the shallow breath of a neighbor half caught in a dream. These were the sounds that meant safety, that meant routine, that meant peace of a kind, and the men listened to them with a strange gratitude. Their dreams were nothing grand, only soft visions of bread, of a warm bed, of someone's voice speaking their name with love. They dreamed of dull days, because dull days were precious, unbroken, safe. As their breathing deepened, their bodies gave in to the heaviness of exhaustion, their minds letting go of the thin threads of worry that had tangled there all day. Morning would come again, just as it always did, with its pale light and its damp chill, and they would rise and check their rifles, and wait, and eat, and work and stand to, and sleep again. The circle would close around them once more, a quiet wheel turning on an axle of mud and habit. And in that circle was a strange comfort, the knowledge that nothing unexpected waited to pounce, that every hour would follow the one before like beads on a string. If you feel your breathing slowing now, if your shoulders have grown heavy, know that this calm was what held them steady, and it can hold you too. Let the dull, safe routines cradle you. Let the sameness of each day become a gentle pillow for your thoughts, and rest without fear of surprise. Sleep comes easier in a world where nothing changes, where each morning is as forgiving as the last, and each night is as quiet as the one before. Drift now as they did into that slow river of peaceful monotony, knowing that it will carry you safely to the other side of sleep. The hours in the trench, unfolded like a long and colorless ribbon, winding day after day through the same motions, the same sounds, the same unbroken dullness that became, over time, almost comforting to the men who lived inside its narrow walls. When the first pale morning light crept through the hanging canvas and found its way onto damp boots and stained blankets, the soldiers began their familiar dance of waking. Limbs stiff from the cold, they stretched slowly, as if every muscle argued against moving at all. Their hands found their boots, the leather still wet, still carrying the clinging mud of countless yesterdays, and pulled them on with a practiced resignation. There was no fresh air to greet them, only the same stale, damp air, thick with the mingled sense of earth, sweat, smoke, and the faint sourness of too many bodies living too close for too long. They moved into their first routine almost without thinking, checking rifles with movements so ingrained they seemed to happen without conscious thought. A pull of the bolt, a wipe of the breech, a quick check of the sights, and then leaning, the weapon against their shoulder with a kind of familiar fatigue. Afterward, they shuffled forward to stand to, peering into a no-man's land that was as still and unchanging as the surface of a gray pond. Broken wires, shattered stumps of trees, and scattered scraps of tin and canvas lay exactly where they had lain yesterday and the day before. Nothing moved, and that was good. Stillness was safety, and boredom was peace. The minutes stretched on in silence, and then, as they always did, the men stepped down, shoulders sinking in relief as they turned back to their morning meal. The bread was hard, the tea thin and a little bitter, the bully beef the same grayish. Slab as ever, but no one complained, because complaint had long since dried up like a puddle in the sun. They ate mechanically, eyes half closed, thoughts drifting to letters they hoped would come, or to tiny scraps of home that still lived somewhere in memory. Breakfast finished, they moved into the day's labor. There were always chores, endless chores, for the trench was a living creature that needed constant feeding and tending, or it would collapse around them. Sandbags had to be restacked where the walls slumped, sometimes breaking under their damp weight. Duckboards needed shifting where the ground had given way to water again, the boards heavy and splintered, biting at palms already rough with cuts. Water pooled in corners, and men took up buckets, tossing brown sludge out over the parapet in a rhythm as old as the trench itself. No one hurried. There was no reason to hurry. The trench could not be finished, could not be perfected, could only be kept from failing one day at a time. The men moved with the same slow steadiness, the same muttered jokes and small curses, the same resigned acceptance of mud as a constant companion. The rats, of course, watched it all, bold little kings of the soggy kingdom, darting from one crate to another, dragging crusts of bread with them as trophies. A few men tried half-heartedly to chase them off, but mostly they were ignored, part of the trench like everything else, unwelcome but unavoidable. A man might pause in the middle of his labor to scratch at a line of lice hiding in his collar, fingernails working through the seams of his shirt with a practiced flick, then return to shoveling as if nothing had happened. Lice were simply another fact of trench life, as persistent as the mud and about as interesting. The afternoon came on without any fuss, bringing the same gray sky that seemed too tired to even offer rain. A ration party arrived, carrying tins that clanked together in tired rhythm, the same bully beef, the same stale biscuits, the same precious pinch of tea. The men lined up without complaint, eyes lowered, hands ready to take their share. No one fought for more. No one tried to jump the line, because they all knew the truth. It would be the same tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. A joke might slip between two soldiers. A grin flashed over a tin of meat, but even humor seemed dulled, as if the trench had wrung the bright edge off every emotion. They ate in their usual spots, knees up, backs against sagging walls, the chatter low and steady, voices too tired to rise. When the food was gone, they returned to their labors. A trench step had collapsed overnight and needed rebuilding, and the sandbags above were sagging forward with the weight of rain. The men rebuilt it slowly, packing mud into new sacks, stacking them 2 by 2, tamping them down with a rhythm that felt almost sacred in its predictability. There was comfort in knowing exactly what to do, in knowing that no one would change the rules, that no one would expect anything surprising. This was a world where monotony had its quiet power, a blanket that dulled fear and smoothed over the sharp corners of worry. As dusk approached, the ritual of stand-to repeated. Rifles checked again, helmets adjusted, men lining up in a hush that held no excitement, only the soft dread of a world that might suddenly wake up and remember it was supposed to be dangerous. They watched the broken field, the shattered fences, the wire, and then, as always, nothing happened. The relief was a quiet one, not spoken, just a slight loosening of shoulders, a shared look of tired gratitude. The men stepped back to their dugouts, where supper waited. Another helping of bully beef, a cold mug of tea, bread gone hard enough to chip a tooth. They ate slowly, more from habit than hunger, and afterwards settled into their bedding, pulling scratchy blankets around them, boots left on because boots had to stay on. After all, rules had to be followed, even here. The dugouts filled with the sounds of small harmless noises, a cough, a shifting knee, the soft breathing of a man already half lost in dreams. Rats skittered along the walls, bold and unafraid. But no one bothered to chase them away. They were part of the trench's lullaby now, as constant as the water dripping from a leak in the roof, as constant as the faint creak of boards settling under weight. Sleep came in small sips, never a deep draught, but enough to soothe the worst of the day's tiredness. Men dreamed of silly things, of bread fresh from an oven, of a kitchen's warmth, of a mother's gentle voice. They dreamed of days where nothing happened, where the only worry was a patch of rain on washing day, where mud was simply a nuisance rather than a grave. The trench faded from their minds for a few hours, replaced by those quiet memories, so ordinary that they might almost have been precious. Night moved slowly, heavy with damp, stretching its hours out like a thread too thin to break, and morning would come again as surely as it always did, bringing its gray light, its stand-to, its chores, its bread and bully beef and thin tea. And in that certainty was a kind of peace, a rhythm so reliable that a man could sleep without fear of surprise. If your own eyes are growing heavy now, you might feel that same calm, that same hush where nothing changes, where nothing jars you. Awake, where time itself has agreed to leave you alone for a while. Let yourself rest in that gentle sameness, trusting that tomorrow will be no worse and no better than today, and that sometimes that is enough. Close your eyes, let the boring details of this story wrap around you like a warm, familiar blanket, and slip quietly into dreams where even mud can seem kind. where even the smallest routine can be a gift, and where peace comes not from freedom, but from knowing exactly what comes next. In the trenches, the passing of days became a gentle echo, a repeated verse of the same old song, so perfectly predictable that even worry seemed to give up and doze off. Each morning, a dim light slowly crept across the sagging walls of the dugouts, sliding over muddy boots left in place, over worn coats pulled tight against the chill, over helmets stacked neatly in the corner. The soldiers opened their eyes one by one, blinking, into the half-darkness with the sleepy resignation of men who knew exactly what lay ahead. Their bodies felt heavy, back sore from the unforgiving wooden boards, muscles stiff from hours spent curled around their dreams, and the smell of damp wool and earth clung to every breath. There was no rush in their movements as they swung their legs over the sides of their beds, slipping feet back into boots that had never truly dried, lacing up with numb fingers that barely felt the leather anymore. Each man stood, shoulders dropping under the familiar weight of their kit, and collected his rifle, checking it with motions that had long since become second nature. A pull of the bolt, a glance down the barrel, a wipe of any fresh moisture, a nod to no one in particular. As he judged the weapon ready, they lined up for stand to, as always, eyes scanning the same battered landscape, the wire still tangled, the broken trees still clawing at the sky, the earth a dull brown scar that refused to heal. Nothing moved, no birds dared land, no voices carried from beyond. The silence was deep and familiar, a silence so thick it seemed to press against their chests. And when the minutes crawled past without event, they stepped down again, a quiet, shared relief softening their tired faces. Breakfast came next, no surprises there. The same slice of bread, the same thin tea, the same spoonful of bully beef that tasted of salt and old tin. They ate while sitting on crates, elbows on knees, backs bent, saying little. Conversation was a dull murmur, a word here or there about letters from home, about socks wearing thin, about a rumor that someone might get leave in a month. But no one truly expected change, and so no one let their hope rise far. The trench had trained them in the discipline of steady, harmless expectations, and that discipline kept their hearts from breaking. After the meal, they moved into their chores, because the trench never slept and never stayed still. Its walls sagged with every rain, needing new sandbags packed and stacked. Duckboards warped under the weight of countless steps, needing to be straightened, replaced, or nailed down again. Buckets were dipped into brown puddles that collected overnight, scooping water that smelled faintly of rotten oil, throwing it up and over the parapet before watching more trickle in from somewhere. Unseen. The mud was an enemy without a face, relentless, patient, always finding its way back, seeping into boots, working its cold fingers into socks and saws, until men felt half buried even while standing. But they worked against it anyway, with the same resigned energy, shoulders moving steadily, voices low, a half-sung rhythm of curses and soft jokes that made the hours pass more easily. Every so often, a rat darted across their path, bold and curious, its sleek brown back flashing between crates. No one jumped anymore. The rats were as much a part of the trench as the men, feeding on the same crumbs, sleeping in the same corners, living the same endless days. They were company, in a way, and some soldiers even gave them names, finding in them a small spark of something living that did not ask for anything more. The officers walked the line now and then, their steps quiet. On the duckboards, checking boots, scanning rifles, reminding men in tired voices to rub whale all our feet and keep their socks dry. There was no scolding left, no sharpness, only routine, carried out with the same weary respect as any ritual. Midday arrived with no ceremony, just a faint thinning of the clouds, a small shift in the light. Rations were handed out again. Tins of bully beef, stale biscuits, perhaps a dab of jam if a supply truck had made it through the mud. The men lined up, patient, eyes dull but polite, accepting the same meal with the same tired hands. They took their food back to their corners, settling in against damp trench walls, eating in silence or with a soft comment about the taste, about how the bread had grown harder, about how the tea reminded them of dishwater back home. It was a comfort, even in its tastelessness, because it was predictable, and predictability was a blessing. The afternoon was given to small tasks. A trench step to rebuild, a dugout roof to shore up with fresh planks, a latrine that needed draining before it overflowed again. Each job was done slowly, with no hurry, because there was no point in rushing a task that would only need repeating. Tomorrow. Hands worked steadily, scraping, hammering, lifting, moving, while minds drifted along half awake, thinking of home in blurry pieces, a front gate, a line of laundry in the wind, a dog dozing by a warm fire. These memories were soft and gentle, safe to hold, and the men cradled them like small treasures while their shovels bit into mud again and again. When the mail arrived, the energy of the trench lifted just a little. Names were called out, letters handed over, envelopes smudged and bent from their journey. Soldiers unfolded them with care, reading words that spoke of boring, beautiful things: weather, chickens, children learning to read, a cousin's wedding, a neighbor's new fence. These were not stories of war, but stories of life untouched. Buy it, and that made them precious. Some men read their letters twice, 3 times, folding them carefully to tuck against their chests as if the ink itself might keep them warm. Evening crept in, soft and gray, and the stander returned. Men stepping forward with practiced calm, peering into the same wasted landscape, waiting for something that rarely came. The hush was almost holy, a quiet that let their thoughts drift, let their hearts slow, let their fears fade for a moment. When the stand-to ended, they stepped back once more, turning toward supper, another round of bread and beef and tea that had cooled before it reached their lips. They ate as they always did, knees drawn up, backs to the damp wall, voices quiet and slow. And then they made ready for sleep, lying down on the same wooden boards, pulling the same blankets close, leaving their boots on in case an alarm might break the peace of night. But most nights passed gently, nothing stirring except the small scratch of a rat hunting crumbs, the drip of water from a leaking roof, the shifting of a neighbor's tired body. Dreams were mild and colorless, small flickers of normal days, of bread and laughter, of a path that led somewhere green. The trench fell silent, cradling their breathing in its steady, forgiving dullness, letting them rest. If you feel your eyelids growing heavy now, know that the trench men found their peace in this sameness, and you can too. Let the repeated steps and the soft, harmless sounds ease you into a slow drift, carrying you into a night where nothing changes and nothing needs to. Sleep gently, as they did, in the comforting arms of a world that asks only that you keep breathing, keep waiting, keep waking to do it all again, tomorrow. As another day broke over the waterlogged trenches, the soldiers stirred in their narrow dugouts, rising from a half-sleep that barely separated night from day. The routine guided them as surely as any clock, a gentle, mechanical rhythm that carried their tired bodies through motions that had long since lost all surprise. Their boots, heavy with mud and still damp from the day before, waited by their boards, laces curled like sleeping snakes. One by one, the men slid feet inside, wincing as cold leather gripped toes already soft and raw. The stale air of the trench, thick with the mingled sense of wet wool, sour breath, earth, smoke, and the faint bitterness of old tea, wrapped around them like a second skin. Rifles were checked almost automatically, hands moving without command. Pulling the bolt, glancing down the barrel, wiping away any moisture that might have gathered overnight. The men did not speak much, saving their voices for later, conserving words in the same way they conserved their strength. They filed into place for stand to, eyes turned toward the same gray no man's land. A wasteland of broken wire and cratered mud that had not changed in weeks, perhaps months. Nothing moved out there. No birds dared cross it. No smoke rose to mark a farmhouse or a tree. It was a place of stillness so deep that it became its kind of prayer. And as the minutes passed without any sign of the enemy, the men lowered their shoulders and stepped down, moving on to breakfast with the quiet relief that boredom still ruled the day. The meal was the same as always. A slice of stale bread, a spoonful of bully beef, tea so thin it tasted mostly of tin. No one complained, because no one expected anything different, and in that sameness was a strange, gentle safety. After breakfast, the chores began because the trench demanded its careful tending. Sandbags sagged and needed repacking, their seams splitting under the endless press of rain and weight. Duckboards shifted with each footstep, threatening to collapse into the mud, so men carried boards and nails, straightening them with slow, patient hands. Buckets dipped into brown puddles, scooping water and throwing it away over the parapet, only to see more seep up from the soaked ground a moment later. The trench was alive in its dull way, constantly sliding, constantly breaking, needing men to keep it from swallowing them whole. Their movements were unhurried, practiced, as familiar as breathing, and no one asked for rest, because rest was only another way to watch the hours slip by. Lice, of course, were everywhere, crawling through the seams of shirts and trousers, biting along the collar, leaving red trails of itch that never quite healed. The soldiers picked at them absently, crushing them between thumb and nail, barely pausing in their work. It was simply another part of trench life, as natural as mud, as constant as cold tea. From time to time, rats darted through their feet, bold enough to steal crumbs or chew on a bit of cloth, their eyes bright and fearless. Some men named them, tossing crusts their way, making uneasy friends with creatures that thrived in the same filth. Midday arrived, marked not by the sun, which stayed hidden behind heavy gray clouds, but by the arrival of the ration party, carrying crates of tins and hard bread. The line formed without orders, boots scuffing against boards, eyes blank, but patient. Each man accepted his share, knowing it would be the same tomorrow and the day after, and every day until someone told them it was over. They sat along the trench wall, knees pulled to their chests, elbows resting on thighs, chewing slowly while a thin mist gathered on their shoulders. Conversation was rare. A small joke about the taste of the tea, a quiet mention of home, but mostly silence. Afterward, they rose and returned to their work. A collapsed fire step needed rebuilding. Planks had to be braced against a section of wall sliding inward, and a drainage ditch choked with mud had to be dug again. They labored with the calm steadiness of men who knew the trench would never stay fixed for long, but who kept it from falling apart completely with their own quiet hands. Afternoon slid toward evening in the same muted light, and mail was passed around, letters folded and creased from long journeys. The words inside spoke of gardens, of hens, of children's songs, of unremarkable days. The soldiers read them carefully, savoring the dull details of peace that felt like stories from a half-remembered dream. Some folded those letters and tucked them close to their hearts, the paper growing soft with wear. The officers moved down the line, checking boots, giving reminders about socks, about foot oil, about keeping the bolt of the rifle clean. Their voices were gentle, almost fatherly, and no one took offense. The men nodded, accepted the advice, and turned back to their tasks, because there was nothing else to do. As the light began to fade, the stand-to returned, the same formation. The same gaze across a dead landscape, the same heavy quiet. Fingers rested on rifle stocks, boots rooted into the boards, breath coming slow and measured. Nothing moved, and nothing was expected to move. They waited because waiting was the rule, and rules brought order to a world that might otherwise dissolve into chaos. When the signal came to stand down, they stepped away from the parapet, shoulders sagging with the small comfort of another day survived, another day with nothing new to fear. Supper was eaten in the same corners as always, men gathered in small knots, sharing the same food, the same thin jokes, the same distant thoughts of home. The taste no longer mattered, the tea no longer warmed them, but they swallowed it anyway, honoring the ritual because ritual gave shape to days that might otherwise have slipped into shapeless misery. Afterward, they prepared for the night. Blankets were pulled over tired bodies, boots left on, helmets nearby, rifles close to hand. They lay listening to the small noises of the trench, the scuttle of rats, the cough of a neighbor, the soft dripping of water through a split-in, the canvas overhead. These sounds were as familiar as any lullaby, comforting in their predictability, because predictability meant safety. Sleep came slowly, carrying with it images of far-off kitchens, of warm bread, of voices that asked no more of them than to sit and rest. These were small dreams, but precious, and the men clung to them through the night. The trench held them, a narrow cradle of mud and wood and earth, steady beneath their breathing, wrapping around their bones like a second skin. Time moved gently here. It stepped so slow they barely registered, and in that slowness was peace. If your breathing has slowed as you listen, know that you share their calm, resting in the certainty that nothing will change tonight, that nothing must be faced or fought, that you can sleep in this story just as they did, trusting that morning will come with the same soft gray light, the same chores, the same quiet rituals. Let the dull rhythm of this world carry you towards sleep, safe, in the knowledge that tomorrow will be no worse than today, and that sometimes that is enough. Close your eyes, breathe evenly, and rest within this boring, gentle peace, letting each repeated moment cushion your mind until dreams, soft and harmless, arrive to keep you company. The days in the trench continued to stretch into each other, like the threads of a single colorless tapestry, woven so tightly that it became impossible to separate one from the next, the same dull shades repeating until even memory lost its way. As morning found its place above the ragged skyline, the same slow routine played out again, men stirring on their wooden boards, blinking awake inside a world that had never really slept. The stale air pressed down on them, heavy with the mingled sense of mud and sweat, of boots never fully dry, of wool grown sour with damp. The soldiers pulled themselves upright with the steady, patient rhythm of those who knew there was nothing else to do, no other choice but to keep rising, keep dressing, keep carrying on. Their boots, lined with the film of yesterday's cold mud, resisted their feet for a moment, but habit won out, laces tugged tight by hands already numbed by endless chill. Rifles were lifted from their places, each one cradled like an extension. Of the man who bore it, bolts checked, barrels wiped, a practiced ritual as familiar as a prayer. The stand-to followed, as always, men stepping into position along the parapet, eyes turned to the same gray, broken landscape. Nothing moved, not a bird, not a rat, not even a stray breeze. And they stood there in that silence with a shared understanding that stillness was safety, that boredom was better than any sound that might break the calm. When the minutes had passed and nothing stirred, they stepped down once again, shoulders loosening, breath releasing as they turned toward breakfast. The same bread, edges hard, the same tea, thin and nearly flavorless, the same tin of bully beef that had fed them more times than they could count. They ate with small motions, lips barely moving, eyes distant, minds already halfway to the day ahead. After breakfast, the work began, because the trench demanded it as surely as the sun rose. Sandbags, always slumping, needed rebuilding. Water, forever gathering, needed to be scooped away. Duckboards, warped and cracked under 100,000 steps, had to be shifted, hammered, and straightened again. The men moved through these tasks like quiet machines, Voices low, gestures unhurried, carrying out repairs that would last only until the next storm or the next careless boot undid them. And still they kept at it, not because they hoped for reward, but because the rhythm itself was its kind of comfort, a reason to move their bodies, a measure of time they could trust. Rats skittered around them, bold little sentries who had claimed the trench for their own, their quick movements a constant presence that no longer startled anyone. The men accepted them, tossing crumbs when they could, ignoring them otherwise, for they were as much a part of this place as the mud and the wire. Lice, too, refused to leave, their bites sharp but familiar, small reminders of life in every seam and crease. From time to time, a man would pause, scratching along his collar or at the edge of his hairline, and then resume his labor without breaking stride. Letters came in the afternoon, passed hand to hand in a ritual that felt almost holy, names called out in a slow, steady roll, each folded piece of paper a tiny doorway to somewhere kinder. The men unfolded them carefully, reading with eyes that softened for a moment, letting words of cows and weather, of marriages and neighbors, sink into their hearts like a balm. Nothing dramatic was needed. The smallest details of a world without mud were treasures, worth more than any metal. They folded the letters back, pressing them close to their chests, tucking them away to be read again later when night felt too long. The officers moved through then, reminding men about their feet, about their rifles, about their socks, repeating instructions in tired voices that no one questioned, because these were rules that kept them alive. The hours pressed on, afternoon, slipping toward evening with a drizzle that made the walls sweat and the duckboards glisten. The stand-to returned as night approached, men stepping up in slow lines, boots heavy, helmets settled low, eyes scanning a field that had not changed in weeks. They watched in silence, listened for sounds that never came, and felt the calm of a world too quiet to hurt them. After a long pause, they stepped down once more, breathing easier, returning to their dugouts with a small relief. Supper was a mirror of breakfast, the same bread, the same bully beef, the same thin tea, and the men consumed it without complaint, for the taste was less important than the certainty of its presence. When they had finished, they made ready for sleep, arranging blankets across shoulders, boots left on, rifles within reach. The dugouts hummed with tiny noises, the scuffle of rats, the drip of water through split boards, the cough of a neighbor. Settling into dreams. These sounds were familiar, harmless, a lullaby of the trenches that promised, in its way, that no surprises would break the night. Sleep came slowly, gathering around them like a second blanket, softening their muscles, easing their minds, carrying them into half-dreams of things long gone. A mother's quiet humming, the smell of bread baking, the sight of a child running through a green field. These dreams were gentle, and they were enough. Morning would come again, just as it always did, bringing the same tasks, the same rituals, the same calm repetition that somehow kept them whole. If you feel your eyes heavy now, if your breathing has slowed, you share in that quiet with them, resting in a place where nothing changes and nothing is asked beyond rising, working, waiting, and resting once more. Let the rhythm cradle you. Let the gentle dullness wash over your thoughts, and find peace in knowing that tomorrow will be no different, and that sometimes that is the greatest kindness of all. Drift now, as they did, into sleep carried on the backs of routine, unbroken and safe, until dreams find you and carry you through the night. The endless days in the trench moved onward with the same steady, measured pace, like a dull clock ticking its way through time without ever truly advancing. As pale light broke over the sagging walls, the soldiers woke with slow, heavy limbs, lifting themselves from wooden boards that had barely allowed a few hours of restless, fractured sleep. Their bodies felt stiff from the cold, muscles protesting with each movement, yet their hands reached for boots out of habit, pulling them on even as damp leather bit at their skin. the laces stiff with yesterday's grime. They had given up expecting dry feet, just as they had given up expecting warm socks or fresh air, for the trench offered none of those comforts. The stale damp that hung around them felt permanent, clinging to hair and coats, filling every breath. With the scent of earth, old sweat, and a faint metallic edge of rust. Rifles were checked with the same mechanical ritual. Bolts pulled, barrels wiped, stocks tapped against knees to shake off mud. Then, stand to, the morning ritual, men moving wordlessly to the parapet, eyes resting on the familiar wreckage of no man's land. The wires still tangled, the crater still filled with water, the stunted trees still clawing upward as if in silent protest. Nothing changed, and that sameness felt like a mercy, because any change might mean shells, might mean bullets, might mean the end of this fragile peace. They stood for minutes that stretched until thoughts blurred, then stepped down once more, the release of tension almost invisible, but deep. Breakfast was no different from 100 other mornings, stale bread, tea weak as rainwater. Bully. Beef tasting of tin and salt. The men chewed without hurry, eyes half-lidded, letting the food sit in their stomachs like a quiet stone, giving their bodies something to hold on to. There was no conversation beyond the smallest remarks, a mention of a letter, the rumor of a leave, the latest guess about whether the weather might dry. But no one expected it to dry, and no one truly expected to leave. These were stories told not to spark hope, but to pass the time. After the meal, the trench demanded its share of labor. Water to be baled, slumping walls to be reinforced, and duckboards to be straightened and nailed. The tools moved from one man to another with practiced ease, buckets clanging against boards, shovels biting into mud that clung to every scoop like a jealous lover. There was no end to the labor, and yet no rush either, because nothing here was ever truly finished. A man might drain a trench corner only to see it fill again by nightfall, might straighten a duckboard that would buckle under the next boot step. Still, they worked because work gave shape to hours, and hours, once shaped, were easier to bear. The rats skittered in and out of view, bold as ever, their slick brown bodies darting between crates, sometimes pausing to wash their whiskers as if mocking the soldiers' attempts at cleanliness. They had grown fat on crumbs and scraps, unafraid of boots, unafraid of curses, living alongside the men as unwanted companions. And lice, too, continued their quiet invasion, burrowing into seams, biting along shoulders and necks, leaving red marks that no amount of scratching seemed to ease. From time to time, a soldier would pause in his digging to pinch a louse between his nails, then flick it away with a sigh, returning to his work as if swatting at a passing fly. Letters arrived in the afternoon, and for a moment, the routine broke into something softer. Names were called, envelopes handed over, hands trembling just a little as they unfolded pages from home. The words inside rarely told of anything new. News of a neighbor's small harvest, of a sister's engagement, of a baby's first word. These stories were precious precisely because they were ordinary, reminders that the world had not ended. Beyond the wire, that normal life still carried on, steady and forgiving. Men folded these letters into breast pockets, smoothing them flat, pressing them against their hearts like quiet talismans. And then the hours moved forward again, into more tasks. A dugout roof sagged, needing fresh planks, and men worked together. To lift, to nail, to brace it against the next rain. The wood smelled sharp and clean for a moment, before it too became soaked with the trench's damp breath. Boots stomped through puddles, splashing cold water against ankles while voices murmured. Half-finished thoughts, drifting off before anyone cared to answer. As evening fell, the stand-to returned, that quiet, ritual lineup that felt as fixed as sunrise. Rifles held close, eyes peering out over the same still world, the hush so complete that even a distant cough seemed to echo. When the stand-to ended, they stepped back, shoulders relaxing a fraction, returning to their dugouts where supper waited. a mirror of breakfast with no more warmth or flavor to offer. They ate with small motions, knees drawn up, backs pressed against walls that wept water through unseen cracks. Then they prepared for night, shifting on their boards, tucking blankets under chins, boots left on as a rule never to be broken. The dugout air grew close and heavy, filled with the soft sounds of men breathing, the squeak of a rat's claws, the occasional sigh of someone already drifting into half-sleep. Sleep itself came slowly, moving carefully across tired minds, settling into corners left empty by fear, bringing with it dreams that were gentle and small. They dreamed of home, of firesides, of bread and butter, of voices that asked nothing of them but to rest. These dreams were enough to ease their hearts for a few hours, enough to soften the sharp edges of another day spent in mud and routine. The trench wrapped them close, like a damp blanket, familiar and unforgiving, but safe in its way because nothing unexpected waited in its shadows. The night moved on, its darkness unbroken, and the men rested in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same tasks, the same bread, the same careful, boring rituals. If your breathing has grown steady, if your eyelids have grown heavy, you can share their calm now, letting your thoughts fall into the same soft rhythm. Nothing will change, nothing must change, and that is a kindness. Let the quiet hold you. Let the dullness soothe you, and slip gently into dreams, trusting that even mud can be a kind of safety if it never surprises you. Rest here as they did, knowing that peace can come from repetition, and sleep can come from knowing exactly what tomorrow will bring. The trench seemed to breathe along with the men who called it home, its slow, damp rhythms matching the steady beat of their tired hearts, day after day, without end. Another morning crept over the ragged skyline, the dim light gathering across duckboards, still slick with the night's drizzle, over sagging sandbags pressed under the weight of countless rains, over helmets stacked in quiet rows where men had left them the night before. They woke without surprise, bodies stiff from sleep that never fully restored them, eyes heavy with the calm that only endless repetition could bring. One by one, they swung their feet from wooden boards, boots waiting, as they always had, laces stiff with yesterday's crusted mud. Their toes met cold leather, a shock that had long since lost its bite, and they tightened the laces with hands that barely needed to look at the knots. Around them, the stale air was rich with the scent of earth and sweat and old wood, the faint edge of tinned meat and the soft hint of pipe smoke, clinging like a memory. Rifles were checked in silence, each man moving through the same quiet dance of bolt and barrel and stock, a ritual so deeply ingrained it felt almost like breathing. When they stepped out into the trench, they joined the stand-to in an unspoken chorus, eyes scanning the same motionless landscape, where twisted wire tangled over cratered ground and stunted trees held their leafless arms to the pale sky. Nothing moved, not even the birds, and that nothing was its strange blessing. When the all-clear came, they stepped down, shoulders easing, turning toward breakfast with the slow shuffle of men who had no illusions left. The bread was as hard as ever, the tea as thin, the bully beef as salty and stale, but the men took it in without complaint, because complaint had long since drained away with any sense of hope for better. They chewed, they swallowed, they set tin mugs aside with the same practiced thud, and rose to meet the trench's demands. There were walls to shore up, where the damp had caused the packed earth to sag and lean inward like a tired shoulder. Duckboards had slipped under too many boots and needed to be nailed down, straightened, shifted, and lined up again to fight back the creeping mud. Buckets were fetched, dipped, and emptied over and over as men bailed out the brown water that gathered in corners without end. The rhythm of work was its quiet comfort, asking nothing more than steady hands and patient muscles, never surprising, never shifting the balance of what was known. From time to time, a rat crossed their path, bold and sure, nose twitching as it scurried along a plank or paused to chew a crumb. The men barely noticed, except to glance or mutter, for the rats had become as natural a part of the trench as the rain or the cold. Lice, too, carried on their daily assault, hidden along seams and under collars, their bites raising red lines that a soldier might scratch it for a second before turning back to shovel or hammer. No one expected relief, and no one wasted energy fighting it. They simply accepted the presence of these small, unwelcome guests as much a part of life here as bread or bully beef. Midday came with a grayed, tired light, marked only by the arrival of rations. Men lined up without needing to be told, boots thumping against duckboards, eyes low, hands ready. Each received his share: a tin of beef, a slab of bread, perhaps a spoonful of jam if the supply line had been kind. They moved away, settling against the trench walls to eat with knees drawn up, voices low if they spoke at all. The food had no taste left, but the ritual of eating was enough, a pause in the labor, a place to rest the mind as much as the body. Some soldiers turned letters over in their hands, reading familiar words again and again, letting talk of harvests and neighbors, and children's games wrap around their thoughts like a soft blanket. The letters were folded carefully afterward, tucked into pockets near their hearts, a private shield against the damp and the mud. Then the afternoon returned to its routine: more digging, more hammering, more shifting of sacks and planks. A man might pause to stretch his back, look up at the sullen sky, then return to work without a word. The officers moved quietly down the line, offering reminders about socks and feet, about whale oil and clean barrels, their voices calm, unhurried. For there was nothing urgent to say. Everyone knew what was expected, and everyone knew it would be the same tomorrow. Evening crept in without ceremony, drawing shadows over the same torn ground, softening the edges of the trench until everything seemed to blur into the same forgiving gray. Stander returned, men taking their places with a quiet resignation, eyes fixed on the nothingness beyond the parapet, ears tuned for sounds that never came. They waited, breathing together, hearts steady, and when the moment passed, they stepped down with a silent gratitude, knowing that boredom meant safety. Supper was no different from breakfast, another round of bully beef and bread, tea that was only a shadow of warmth. They sat where they could, shoulders hunched, helmets close by, sharing a joke or two in voices so soft they seemed to echo. Then they settled down for the night, drawing blankets up, boots still laced, rifles within reach. The dugouts filled with small sounds: a cough, a rat's quick feet, the drip of water from a canvas seam, the shift of a man adjusting in his sleep. These were the lullabies of the trench, simple and steady, telling them that nothing had changed, that nothing would leap from the dark to steal their peace. Sleep arrived the way it always did, first in fits and starts, then settling deeper, carrying them to dreams that were plain and harmless. A field of green, a table set for supper, a path leading home, voices calling their names with no urgency. These were the dreams that kept their hearts soft, that allowed them to rise again. The next day and the day after, the trench wrapped them in its dull embrace, and they accepted it, because in its boredom was a rare kind of safety, a fragile promise that tomorrow would come in the same pattern. If your breathing has slowed as you listen, know that you share in that calm, resting in the sure knowledge that the same gentle rituals will protect you, that the same quiet will hold you. Let that certainty carry you towards sleep, soft as wool, steady as an old song, with no surprises to wake you, no sharp edges to hurt you, just the calm, familiar path stretching into tomorrow. Rest now as they did, letting each repeated moment lull you until dreams arrive, gentle and patient, to hold you through the night. The hours in the trenches had long ago lost their sharp edges, worn down into a smooth, almost comforting monotony that wrapped itself around each man like a heavy blanket. As another dawn crept over the ragged horizon, its pale light seeping through the torn canvas and settling on damp boots. The soldiers woke as they always did, quietly, without hurry, as though they had never truly slept. Their movements were slow, steady, rehearsed 1,000 times, boots pulled on over socks that had barely dried, laces tugged tight by hands that no longer expected warmth or comfort. The air was thick with the familiar scent of earth and sweat, damp wool, smoke, and the faintly bitter edge of old, boiled tea. Each man checked his rifle with the same unbroken ritual, sliding the bolt back, glancing along the barrel, wiping away the night's condensation with practiced fingers that felt half asleep even in daylight. Then came stand to, as natural as breath, the men filing into place along the parapet, boots shifting on duckboards made slick by endless drizzle. They gazed out over the same unmoving land, a world of twisted wire and broken trees, craters filled with still water, all of it colored in shades of gray and brown. The silence was deep and patient, a hush that seemed to soothe as much as it threatened. Nothing moved, and that was good. After long minutes, the word came to stand down, and they stepped back, shoulders relaxing, minds easing back toward their daily labors. Breakfast offered no surprises, the same stale bread, a smear of bully beef, tea too thin to warm them. They ate without complaint, knees drawn up, eyes half closed, swallowing each bite like a small familiar ritual that anchored them to the morning. There was a strange peace in knowing exactly what to expect, in never having to wonder what might appear on the plate. Afterward, they gathered tools and moved into their routine, tending to the trench with a kind of resigned care. Shovels bit into mud that seemed to cling to every blade. Buckets lifted and emptied again and again to chase away the standing water that refused to leave. Sandbags sagged and split under their damp weight, needing to be repacked and stacked, with hands that had done it so many times that each motion came without thought. Duckboards were adjusted where they had worked, nails tapped back into place with dull, steady taps that echoed softly against the earth walls. The work was endless, but there was comfort in its predictability, in knowing that no matter how many times the trench tried to collapse, they could build it back again, over and over. Rats, quick and fearless, ran through their feet and along. The planks, sometimes bold enough to climb onto a ration crate or nibble at a forgotten crust. The men barely noticed, save for the occasional quiet laugh or curse, for the rats had become as much a part of the place as the mud itself. Lice, too, continued their quiet occupation, hiding in seams, biting along the back of the neck, a soft, irritating reminder of life that never left. Now and then, a man would pause to scratch, flicking a louse away with a sigh before returning to his shovel. There was no real anger left for these pests, only acceptance. Midday brought the ration line, a small break in the labor. The men queued up without instruction, eyes tired but calm, taking their share of bully beef, bread, sometimes a scrape of jam if fortune had passed through. They carried their food back to the same places, knees drawn tight, backs pressed against trench walls that sweated dampness through old, patched canvas. They ate slowly, conserving energy, trading a word or two about home or nothing at all. No one dreamed of banquets anymore. They dreamed of bread that was merely fresh, tea that was simply hot, of meals eaten without rain dripping off the bill of a helmet. And after the food, the work returned, as steady as a heartbeat. A duckboard slipped sideways and had to be lifted and reset. A dugout roof sagged under the slow press of rain, needing new braces nailed across its beams. Boots sloshed through. Puddles that seemed to form from nowhere, soaking feet that had never fully dried. Still, the men worked, voices low, sharing the weight of a shovel or a hammer, swapping small jokes that felt as old as the mud itself. Afternoon blurred into evening, and letters came with it, names called softly by the post-runner, hands reaching up, eager even for scraps of news that told of things so wonderfully dull. A neighbor's cow calving in spring, a sister's new apron, a child's school lesson. These details mattered more than any medal, for they spoke of a world untouched by wire or shells, a world worth returning to. The men folded the letters neatly, pressing them against their chests as if the ink alone might warm them. Evening. Standu arrived as predictably as the dawn. Men lining up, rifles checked yet again, eyes turned toward a world that had not changed. The quiet was heavy but kind, holding them in a place where fear was, for a time, forgotten. When they stood down, they stepped back to supper, another round of bread, batted in beef and tea, each bite exactly like the morning's. They chewed with tired jaws, letting their minds drift into a gray, peaceful emptiness that needed no bright dreams. When they finished, they arranged themselves for the night, boots left on, helmets closed, rifles leaning within arm's reach. The dugout was close and damp, filled with the rustle of blankets, the cough of a neighbor, the scratch of rats searching for crumbs. Sleep came on its own quiet feet, finding them easily, for the trench had made them expert at resting wherever they could. Their dreams were soft and colorless, a warm kitchen, a loaf of bread, a friendly voice calling them home. Nothing wild, nothing loud, just the steady balm of memory. The night was calm, and they trusted it to stay calm, trusting the rules and rituals that held them steady through every hour. If your breathing has slowed while listening, let it match theirs. Let your shoulders sink the way theirs did, giving in to the familiar, to the peace of knowing nothing new waits in the dark. Rest in that sameness where every footstep is measured, every bite known, every sound expected, where sleep is simply a return to the same safe routine. The trench, for all its mud and cold, offered them this, the chance to be still, to stay unchanged, to breathe without surprise. Let that dullness carry you too, soft as old wool, steady as a tired heartbeat, until you find dreams waiting at the end of the day, dreams that need nothing but the quiet to grow. Sleep gently now as they did, in the calm of a world where tomorrow will be the same, and the day after, and the day after that. A promise of peace and repetition that can hold you safely all through the night. The trench seemed to stretch endlessly. In both directions, a silent ribbon of damp earth and rotting wood that held the men close like a tired mother cradling restless children. As another morning opened its pale, reluctant light across the duckboards, the soldiers woke once more, slow and stiff, as though their bones had forgotten how to bend through a night spent half sleeping, half listening. Around them, the air was thick with the same sour scent of sweat soaked into blankets, of smoke drifting in from a smoldering cigarette butt, of stale bread and bully beef lingering from last night's meal. Boots waited near their makeshift beds, still marked with mud from yesterday, and the men pulled them on with the kind of resignation that comes only from knowing no other option will ever appear. Their feet, already raw and soft from weeks in, the damp slid into the clammy leather, and they tugged the laces tight with steady, practiced hands. Their eyes barely flickered with emotion as they checked their rifles, bolts drawn back, barrels cleared of fresh night moisture, stock settled against shoulders in a ritual more familiar than prayer. Standa came next, as regular as the sun. The men filing into place at the parapet, boots braced on boards that creaked under their weight. Their eyes scanned the same familiar waste beyond the trench, a gray world where torn wire sagged between crooked posts, where shell craters brimmed with water so still it reflected the colorless sky, where nothing moved except perhaps the faint drifting of smoke far down the line. That nothingness was their comfort, a promise that no attack would come this morning. After minutes that felt longer than they truly were, they stepped down together, shoulders softening, and moved on to breakfast. No one expected anything different on the menu. Bread gone hard around the crust, tea brewed thin enough to be mistaken for rainwater, bully beef that clung to the spoon in a cold, greasy lump. They ate without words, eyes low, each man sinking into his quiet thoughts, letting the warm bitterness of tea settle in their chest. After the meal, The day's tasks took hold, as faithful and dull as ever. Buckets dipped into puddles, lifted with aching arms, and emptied over the trench wall. To fight back the ever-returning water, sandbags split along their seams had to be refilled and stacked again. Men packing the mud tight, balancing the sacks one atop another until the trench wall stood straight, if only for a moment. Duckboards shifted under countless steps, nails, worked loose by the endless rhythm of boots, and so they were hammered back into place with dull thuds that barely registered as sound. Around them, rats patrolled boldly, their whiskers twitching as they hunted crumbs, and no man bothered chasing them away. They were trench brothers now, as expected as lice crawling through the seams of a collar. A scratch at the nape of the neck, a quick pinch, a louse flicked away. These movements were no longer even worth pausing for. They were as natural as breathing, as dull as the thin breeze that sighed down the length of the trench. Midday arrived with no ceremony, marked only by the arrival of the ration party, tins clinking, boots scuffing, the routine so unchanged it barely felt like an event. The men lined up without orders, hands waiting for bread, beef, perhaps a smear of jam if luck had held. They took their share, found a dry enough board to sit on, and ate while their eyes drifted along the trench wall or toward a letter folded carefully in a pocket. Conversation was gentle, soft, a comment about a mother's handwriting, a mention of a girl back home, a laugh so small it barely rippled the stale air. Then back to work, to mending boards, bailing water, lifting buckets, shifting sacks, repeating the steps that had kept the trench standing through rain and shells and time itself. Their movements were patient, resigned, somehow steady even as muscles ached. Each man understood that no one else would fix this place for them. The trench demanded their hands every day, the same as it had yesterday and would tomorrow. Later, a quiet moment might pass as a soldier pulled out a letter, unfolding the pages with slow, careful fingers. The words inside were precious precisely because they spoke of boring, gentle days beyond the wire, children's lessons, neighbors visiting, the price of flour, a new foal in the stable. These tiny details of a world untouched by mud felt like treasure, and the men folded the letters back against their hearts, pressing them there as if the paper itself could shield them from the gray around them. Afternoon drifted toward evening, light fading behind the low walls, and Stander returned. The same patient lineup, rifles checked again, helmets straightened, boots braced on boards that had seen 1,000 such evenings. They watched the quiet land, a silence that held them together, their breath coming slow and deep as they waited for a sign that rarely came. When the moment passed, they stepped down once more, easing shoulders, turning toward supper. Supper was just as expected. Bread, beef, tea grown cold. They ate in the same spots, knees pulled up, backs against damp walls. The familiar discomfort strangely welcome because at least it did not change. Then they settled for the night, blankets gathered around their shoulders, boots left on, rifles close at hand. The dugout filled with small noises, a cough, the shuffle of a rat, water dripping into a tin pail, the soft snore of a neighbor. These sounds were comforting, in their way, promising that no surprises waited in the dark. Sleep came slowly, one blink at a time, sinking through tired bones until their dreams arrived, calm and small. They dreamed of bread baking, of clean linen, of a child's laugh, of a dog barking in a field, images so gentle that they were precious. The trench did not steal those dreams, only wrapped them in a steady rhythm that kept nightmares away. If your breathing has slowed as you listen, feel how safe that sameness can be, how steady. There is no hurry here, no shock, nothing to jolt you from your rest. Let your thoughts rest on the small details, the creak of a board, the smell of wet wool, the hush of boots stepping carefully on duckboards, and trust that tomorrow will come with the same quiet promise. Nothing will change, nothing needs to, and that is its kind of peace. Close your eyes now, letting the gentle routine carry you like a soft tide until dreams come and hold you through the night. Steady and safe, the trench had become more than a place. It was a mood, a rhythm, a quiet echo in each man's bones, guiding them through days so similar they might have been copied one from the next. As another dawn rolled itself across the ragged edge of the dugout roof, the men woke with slow, resigned movements, eyes heavy, bodies stiff from the night's half-rest. The stale air carried the scent of wool that never fully dried, the hint of cold mud soaked into leather, and a faint, ever-present shadow of smoke from ration fires long since burned out. Their boots waited at the edge of the boards, damp laces, twisted and knotted, their shape hardened by repeated soakings. One by one, the men pushed their feet inside, feeling the cold embrace of leather that had forgotten how to be soft, and tightened their boots with fingers that barely felt the chill anymore. Their rifles were checked with motion so automatic they hardly seemed to see what they touched. A wipe of the bolt, a glance down the barrel, a tap against the stock. Then stand to, the steady ritual, boots lining the duckboards in a patient row, men lifting their eyes to the same unchanging scene beyond the trench. The world outside was gray, a blank canvas of wire and shell craters and battered tree stumps that had not grown or shifted since the last sunrise. A few moments passed, the air thick with silence, and then they stepped down, satisfied that nothing new had come to interrupt their dull peace. Breakfast followed, the same as ever, bread that tested teeth with its hardness, tea thin and warm only for a heartbeat, bully beef that no longer even smelled of anything but its tin. The men chewed with slow jaws, their eyes unfocused, letting the familiar taste settle them into the day. They did not expect variety, and so they were not disappointed. After breakfast, the work began again, as necessary as breathing. Buckets clanged against boards as they were lowered into fresh puddles of water that seemed to breed overnight, then lifted and thrown out over the parapet in endless repetition. Sandbags sagged where the rain had pushed their seams apart, so mud was shoveled in, packed down, tied off, and stacked again with the weary expertise of men who had done it 100 times before. Duckboards shifted under heavy steps, nails loosening with each day's wear, and so hammers rang out with a dull, patient rhythm, driving them back into place. There was no finish line, no sense of completion, only the knowledge that if they did not tend the trench, it would swallow them. That was enough reason to keep going, and the men moved through their tasks with quiet acceptance. Rats scurried along the duckboards as if they owned the place, bold noses sniffing at crusts of bread, black eyes gleaming in the gloom. The soldiers hardly noticed them anymore, barely lifting a boot or muttering a curse, for the rats had become trench fellows, as much a part of the routine as lice biting along collars or mud caked around shins. When a man paused to scratch at a red line left by a louse, he did it with the same casual calm as he might scratch his chin, then returned to his shovel or his hammer without breaking stride. These small discomforts had become a language of their own, a way of marking time. Midday arrived with no fanfare, just a faint change in the light, and the ration party brought tins clanking against each other in the arms of silent men. Lines formed without being told, each soldier waiting for bread, beef, a scrape of jam if the supply line had favored them. They accepted it all without complaint, settling against the trench walls to eat with knees drawn tight, backs pressed into the familiar damp. Words drifted between them, lazy and slow, talk of home, of nothing, of the same question about when this all might end, though no one believed it would soon. After lunch, more work waited. A fire step that had slipped forward under too much weight needed bracing with rough planks. A corner of the trench had caved in and needed to be shoveled out, the mud heavy, clinging to hands like a stubborn child. Boots squelched with each step, thick brown water creeping back into places the men had emptied just hours before. They worked without hurry, for the trench had taught them that nothing was ever finished, and a job done today would return tomorrow with the same dull urgency. As the afternoon folded into evening, letters arrived, names called out in a voice barely louder than the wind. Hands reached for those folded bits of paper, handling them as if they were made of gold leaf. Words from home spilled across the page, words about cows calving, about neighbors planting turnips, about sisters marrying boys from the next farm over. These details were precious precisely because they were so boring, so perfectly untouched by mud and war. The soldiers read them over and over, tucking them inside breast pockets close to their hearts, as if the ink itself could warm them. Then came evening stand-to, another slow ritual. Men lifting rifles once more, eyes moving over the same landscape they had seen that morning. Nothing had changed, and that was a blessing. After the stillness had stretched long enough, they stepped down, letting their shoulders drop, letting their breath ease, moving towards supper. The same bread, the same beef, the same tea, nothing different, and nothing expected to be. They ate slowly, knees pulled up, voices softer now, exchanging a few half-hearted jokes or simply sitting in silence. When they finished, they gathered what blankets they had, pulled them tight over thin shoulders, boots left on, rifles propped nearby. The dugout filled with small harmless sounds, a cough, the tiny scuttle of a rat, the soft breathing of a neighbor easing into sleep. These sounds had become a lullaby, familiar, reassuring, telling them that nothing had changed, that nothing would disturb their peace. Sleep came slowly but surely, sliding into tired minds like a kind hand, letting dreams take shape in muted colors, bread fresh from an oven, a mother's voice singing a small song, the clink of a pail in a warm kitchen. These dreams were gentle, and they were enough. The trench around them stayed solid, unmoving, holding their rest in a muddy, quiet embrace that asked nothing more of them than to wake and do it all again tomorrow. If you feel your own eyes growing heavy now, let the calm of this steady world settle across your shoulders. Let the rhythm of repeated steps and repeated days soothe your thoughts. And know that in a place where nothing changes, peace can grow like a quiet flower. Close your eyes, rest in that sameness, and let sleep find you gently, carrying you forward through the night toward another safe, predictable dawn. In the quiet cradle of the trench, another day arrived with its pale, muted light creeping over. Mud-caked boots and splintered duckboards that had known countless mornings just like this one. The men woke slowly, the night having offered only thin scraps of rest, their bones as heavy as the blankets they shook from their shoulders. Dampness clung to every surface, a cold, persistent companion that wrapped around them tighter than any cloth, seeping through shirts, into socks, into skin, until it became a part of them. They moved without hurry, the familiar ache in their joints reminding them that no dream could ever truly steal them from this place. One by one, they reached for their boots, their hands tracing the worn seams and hardened leather before forcing their swollen feet back inside. A ritual so deeply ingrained it had become instinct. Their rifles waited close by, and they lifted them in the same practiced way, checking the bolt, wiping the barrel, tapping the stock against a knee, motions older than memory. There were no surprises in these tasks, and that was a blessing. Soon came stand-to, the gentle choreography of boots finding a place along the boards, eyes scanning a world that refused to change. Beyond the parapet, the same shattered trees, stretched crooked branches into the sky, the same wire hung torn and rusted. The same pools of rainwater glimmered with a dull metallic shine. Silence lay across the fields like a gray sheet, heavy, patient, unbroken. After long moments, they stepped down, breathing out in a single quiet wave, moving toward breakfast. Nothing different waited there, only bread turned hard at the crust. Tea so thin it carried more memory than taste, bully beef heavy on the tongue. They ate in slow, even bites, knees drawn up, elbows on thighs, eyes distant as though seeing far beyond the trench walls. The food was not meant to please, only to fill, and it did just enough. Once finished, the day unfolded around them with its steady demands. Buckets scraped against duckboards, dipped into water that gathered in every low place, lifted and emptied in a rhythm so familiar that the sound barely registered. Mud clung to every tool, every boot, refusing to be moved, and the men fought. It not with anger, but with the calm patience of those who knew it win in the end, but must still be challenged. Sandbags were packed and stacked with methodical care, hands finding the right weight of earth, the right twist of twine, the right place to brace them against a sagging wall. Duckboards shifted under footfall and had to be nailed back, each hammer strike echoing softly through the trench, a kind of heartbeat that tied them to the day. Rats scurried among them, bold as ever, nosing along the edges of ration tins or pausing to wash whiskers, their black eyes glinting in a place where no other spark lived. The soldiers barely noticed, accepting them as trenchmates, sharing the same scraps and the same silence. Lice kept their quiet war alive, biting along shirt seams, creeping under collars, their itch a familiar and unwelcome reminder of how close a man could be to the dirt he stood in. A scratch behind the ear, a pinch along a sleeve, and the men carried on, the interruption barely worth a breath. Midday crept in with the same dull sky, marked only by the ration party's slow procession. Boots lined up with no hurry, hands reaching for bread, beef, maybe a dab of jam if luck had traveled down the supply line that week. The men took their share, breaking bread in small bites, letting the same thin tea chase it down. Words passed between them in quiet tones, talk of home, of wives, of neighbors, of the names of children who might already have forgotten the weight of a father's hug. No one spoke of battles or shells or gunfire. There was no need to break the calm with such things. After lunch, work continued because the trench never stayed still. Walls leaned where the rain had softened their shape, and so shoulders pressed against planks while shovels dug out the worst of the slump. Duckboards shifted and needed bracing. Water pooled again and needed lifting. An endless cycle that felt almost sacred in its repetition. The men labored side by side, sharing a small laugh now and then, a word of quiet encouragement, but never raising their voices above the hush that had settled in the trench like a second skin. Time itself seemed to slow here, stretching the hours until each moment felt the same as the last, and none of them could say exactly when the afternoon turned to evening. A letter arrived, passed down careful hands, opened with the tenderness one might use to touch a newborn. The words inside were simple, precious in their dullness, a mention of a field plowed for the spring, a sister's wedding, a neighbor's new roof. These words built a bridge back to a world that felt impossibly far, but still waited with quiet patience for their return. Evening stand-to followed, the men lifting rifles once more, boots braced on boards grown slick with the days. Slow rain, eyes turned outward in that gentle, watchful calm. Nothing moved, and that was good. Nothing changed, and that was better. When stand-to ended, they stepped down into the familiar routine of supper, bread and beef, the tea grown cold before they could finish it. They ate without hurry, letting the ritual steady them for the night ahead. Then they settled into their bunks, boots still on, helmets within arm's reach, rifles leaned close by. The dugout air grew thick with their breathing, the small sounds of rats moving, the drip of water from some hidden leak, the slow, careful shifting of a neighbor settling into sleep. These sounds became a lullaby, repeating in the background until they blurred into a soft haze. Sleep came one blink at a time, wrapping itself around tired minds, carrying them to dreams that were nothing more than fragments, the smell of bread fresh from an oven, the touch of clean linen, a fire crackling in a safe place. These small, boring dreams were the best they could wish for, a comfort so gentle it almost hurt. Morning would come again, and they would wake the same way, move the same way, eat the same way, and the trench would welcome them with the same quiet, unchanging arms. If your breathing has slowed, if your shoulders have softened, you share in their calm, trusting that nothing will surprise you tonight, that the rhythm will hold you just as it held them. Let yourself drift in that sameness, safe from all sharpness, carried by repetition into a sleep that will protect you until another pale dawn calls you awake, ready to live one more day exactly as before. The day began as countless days had begun. Before it, with a soft, pale light crawling its way over the sagging canvas and settling on the rows of men who had slept in the trenches close. Damp air, their dreams no deeper than the thickness of their scratchy blankets. They opened their eyes slowly, the dullness of rest lingering in their limbs, and pulled themselves upright in motions so familiar they barely noticed them happening. Around them, the trench yawned and stretched as if waking too, boards creaking. Under boots, mud shifting under steps, water dripping softly from makeshift roofs. The smell was always the same, an unshakable blend of wet earth, wool, stale smoke, and the lingering bite of old tea. They reached for their boots without thinking, finding them exactly where they had left them, mud-caked and stiff, ready to welcome cold feet once again. Fingers pulled at the laces, tying them tight with practiced mechanical steadiness, each knot a small reassurance that nothing had changed overnight. Rifles came next, cradled in the same way one might hold a child. Checked with a swipe of a cloth, a pull of the bolt, a soft nudge of the stock against the knee. There was no sense of urgency, only the calm steadiness of ritual. Stand-to arrived as naturally as breath, boots lining up on duckboards, helmets lowered, eyes trained on a world that seemed frozen in place. The wire still drooped between splintered stakes, the earth still pitted with water-filled holes, the trees still reaching broken fingers toward a dull sky. Nothing moved, nothing threatened, and in that stillness was a kind of grace. When the signal came, they stepped down together, shoulders easing, lungs letting go of a breath they had not realized they were holding. Breakfast came in its usual, predictable shape, bread gone hard enough to crack against the teeth, tea warm for a heartbeat, and then as cold as the air, bully beef that offered its tin flavor without apology. They ate in silence. A few words passed softly about letters, about weather, about a family member's name that drifted into memory. Nothing deep, nothing important, because nothing had changed. After breakfast, the labor of the day waited patiently, as steady as sunrise. Buckets dipped into puddles, lifting the same brown water that had gathered overnight, carried to the parapet, and thrown out with a splash that barely disturbed the air. Shovels worked in measured strokes, pulling collapsed earth back into place, shaping walls that would sag again by evening. Duckboards had to be lifted, hammered, and shifted until they lay flat, waiting for the next line of boots to wear them down once more. There was no end to it, but that was fine. No one wanted an end, because an end meant change, and change was frightening in its unpredictability. Rats went about their day, weaving through boots and over rations, whiskers twitching, their eyes dark and quick. The men hardly noticed them anymore, just another part of the background, like the mud, like the cold, like the ever-present lice that burrowed into shirts and collars and made their homes against skin. A scratch here, a pinch there, a quick flick of a louse away, and then hands returned to work without pause. Midday rolled in like a cloud, marked only by the line forming for rations. Tin after tin, a piece of bread, a smear of jam if luck had. Held out, passed from one tired hand to another. They sat along the trench wall, elbows on knees, heads lowered, voices quiet, sharing a bite or two with a friend, or holding their bread against their chest for a moment, as if warming it might make it taste better. A few laughed gently, the sound so soft it was hardly laughter at all, sharing some joke that had made the rounds 100 times before. Afterward, they stood and returned to their tasks, nails in one hand, a hammer in the other, duckboards. shifting beneath them as they balanced, steady as rocks, repairing, bracing, adjusting. A dugout roof had leaked again, and planks needed to be shifted, propped up, nailed down. The water dripping onto their shoulders in a slow, steady beat that became almost musical in its predictability. Afternoon faded into evening without drama, the sky growing just a shade darker, the same muted colors painting the horizon. Mail arrived, a precious break in the routine. A few folded envelopes passed between mud-caked fingers. They opened them, carefully reading slowly, letting each word sink in like a blessing. A mention of a cousin's wedding, a harvest festival in a far-off village, a baby's first steps. These small stories kept them alive, kept them breathing, reminders of why they still woke every day to face this sameness. The letters were folded neatly, smoothed with thumb and forefinger, and slipped into breast pockets close to the heart. Evening stand came next, the final quiet ritual, men stepping forward, shoulders squared, rifles lifted, eyes searching across a land that looked the same as it had that morning. And that was all they wanted. No movement, no noise, no sudden shapes. When nothing happened, they stepped down, relief a silent guest in every lung, turning back toward supper. Another helping of bully beef, bread hard enough to scrape the roof of a mouth, tea gone cold before it could warm fingers. They ate with slow, patient bites, letting the calm wrap around them like a second blanket. Then they settled for the night, shifting under thin, damp covers, boots still laced, helmets near, rifles leaning close. The dugout hummed with the same night chorus, the scratch of rats in a corner, water dripping with slow, rhythmic taps, a cough that seemed to echo. Without urgency. These sounds were soft and familiar, and in their familiarity came peace. Sleep approached gently, sliding over them like a quiet hand, pulling their minds into small, safe dreams. Bread baking, a mother's soft voice, a sister's wedding dress, fields left waiting for spring. These dreams were enough, sweet in there. Simplicity, soothing in their dullness. The trench held them steady, a constant, unchanging world that asked nothing new of them, demanded no courage but the patience to wake again. If you, too, have felt your eyes growing heavy, let that sameness hold you. Let the rhythm settle you. Let every repeated step be a comfort against any sharp edge of worry. Rest now, trusting that tomorrow will be exactly like today, calm, predictable, dull in the best way, and that this gentle boredom will keep you safe until sleep carries you through the night and into another day. The same as this one, and the next, and the next. The morning unfolded across the trench in the same way it always had, a gentle, colorless light seeping through sagging sheets of canvas, landing on the rough edges of duckboards that had survived another night of rain and restless feet. The men woke without urgency, their bodies rising from their shallow, uneasy sleep as if answering a call they no longer questioned. Around them, the familiar, heavy air pressed close, a mix of wet wool, stale breath, earth, and the faintest memory of cold tea. They moved quietly, boots already waiting, stiff and damp with a coat of half-dried mud that would never truly leave them. Each man slid his swollen feet inside with a practiced shudder, pulling the laces tight in a series of movements so rehearsed it barely counted as thought. Rifles came next, cradled like trusted companions, checked with the same measured calm. Bolts pulled, barrels glanced over, the stock resting steady against a knee before being slung once again over a tired shoulder. There was no hurry, no rush, because nothing would change whether they moved fast or slow. Standu called them forward in its familiar silent voice, drawing them out onto duckboards still slick from the night. They faced the same pale, broken landscape, the torn wire, the shell-shattered trees, the pools of water that had grown stale under a colorless sky. The men stood, eyes soft and unfocused, breathing together in that easy rhythm that belonged to people who no longer feared surprises. When the moment passed, they stepped down again, shoulders dropping in a silent wave of relief, and turned. Toward breakfast. The same bread that cracked at the crust. The same tea that carried more memory than flavor. The same bully beef that had become a daily punctuation mark were passed from one hand to another. They ate in a hush, knees drawn up, heads bent over steaming tin mugs, voices barely brushing the air with a word here and there about a name from home, a letter they hoped to see. After the meal, the trench reached for them again, demanding its small, patient labors. After the meal, the trench reached for them again, demanding its small, patient labors. Buckets scraped against, duckboards as water was lifted from puddles and flung over the side in a gentle arc that returned almost before it left. Sandbags, slumping from their slow soaking, were packed and stacked, each one tied off and pressed into place by hands grown expert at fighting a battle that would never end. The walls of the trench sighed under their attention, holding for a moment, then sagging again as if too tired to stand. Duckboards shifted and needed hammering, nails tapped with a steady rhythm that matched the men's breathing. They worked without hurry, accepting the trench as a living, crumbling thing that would never be truly finished. Rats scurried along, their boots bold enough to stand and wash whiskers between bites of a crumb, their bright eyes unafraid, their quick steps as much a part of the trench as the lice that crawled through collars and bit at necks with tiny, sharp reminders of shared discomfort. The men hardly noticed these tiny enemies anymore. They were simply there, as inevitable as mud. When midday came, the ration party arrived, bringing a rhythm that felt like another piece of the day's design. Lines formed without orders. Men stepped forward, boots sinking into boards grown soft with rot, hands reaching for bread, tins of bully beef, a spoonful of jam if fortune had been kind. They sat along the walls of the trench, backs pressed against boards, knees up, eating slowly, voices passing in quiet streams of half-thoughts, a memory of a sister's birthday, a rumor about a corporal's leave, a small wish for the sun to dry even just one shirt. There was no talk of shells or advances, because there was no place for them in this lull, in this gentle, boring rhythm that held everyone steady. When lunch ended, the afternoon folded itself around the men like a soft blanket, drawing them back to their chores. A dugout roof had slipped under the night's drizzle and needed bracing with new planks. A drainage ditch had clogged with mud and had to be cleared with slow, sucking shovelfuls. The work felt endless, but its endlessness was soothing, a predictable string of tasks that measured out the hours in safe, steady beats. The officers passed by from time to time, boots quiet on the duckboards, eyes scanning for anything dangerous, but finding only the same repairs, the same faces, the same quiet. They gave reminders about socks, about whale oil for toes, about checking rifle bolts, their voices soft, more habit than warning, and the men nodded without speaking, folding these reminders into their calm routine. Evening arrived the way morning had, slowly, gently, without drama. Stanton drew the men up once more, eyes resting on a world that did not change, boots set steady, rifles balanced with calm hands. There was no movement beyond the parapet, only the slow dimming of the day and the faint drift of smoke from a fire somewhere far off. The men watched, breathing together, hearts beating with the same dull, forgiving rhythm that had carried them through 1,000 such moments. When the order came, they stepped down again, voices soft, shoulders loosening, turning back toward supper. Another helping of bread, another spoonful of beef, another cup of tea that lost its heat too quickly to matter, but warmed their hands for a second, which was enough. They finished without hurry, arranging blankets in their corners, leaving boots laced, helmets within reach, rifles propped close. The dugout took on its night sounds, the soft drip of water, the scuffle of a rat testing a crumb, the half-cough of a man slipping into uneasy dreams. These were comforting sounds in their way, because they were known, expected, part of the lullaby the trench offered to anyone willing to listen. Sleep arrived in its usual, hesitant way, resting across shoulders, softening thoughts, pulling images from far away. A kitchen lamp, a folded tablecloth, a dog curled by a hearth. These dreams were simple, gentle, unremarkable, and therefore precious, asking for nothing but a moment of peace. The trench held them safely in its familiar arms, and they let it, because peace was a pattern, a slow, boring pattern that wrapped around them tighter than any bullet or shell ever could. If your breathing has slowed now, let it stay slow. Let your thoughts sink into this sameness, this calm, this pattern, and trust that tomorrow will be another day just like this one, and the next after that, each one carried on. The steady shoulders of quiet work, small talk, repeated steps, and predictable peace. Rest in that rhythm, letting sleep take you the same way it took them, gently, with no surprises, carrying you through the night toward another pale, forgiving dawn.